I feel like so hilarious that I'm doing a podcast right now.
Wow.
Because I feel like podcasting as a format it's an interesting type of new media that has certain connotations is one thing, but then also I feel like is a sign of the way that we as a society have started to like consume and produce information at these like incredibly, in some ways like can be extractivist, and in some ways can be like a symptom of the fact that we value production over so much else. Productivity, production, information itself as like a kind of production and consumption is probably like one of the things that the podcast era has signified. I haven't read like McLuhan in a really long time, but I feel like there's probably something there.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a top-down way to look at podcasts and then a bottom-up way. And I, as somebody who's just trying to learn as quickly as possible while being in Korea, podcasting has been an accelerant for me to learn and just try and get like an understanding of what's happening in Korea, because like I'll have a podcast with somebody and then somebody will be like, I disagreed with this point, and this point, or like this person's experience was totally like ignorant of these other viewpoints, and then people will reach out and then I'll be able to have conversations with them. And so the whole like learning in public thing becomes very valuable for me while I'm building Cambridge. But from a top-down perspective, I can see how like the shifting media landscape of there are both pros and cons, and maybe the cons are quite problematic in some regards. But.
Well, I think it's like I don't really have a normative take on this, which is actually something that I say to you often. I feel like I don't really have like a normative take on like what the individual's choice inside of the media landscape or the structure is. But I think my sense is that like, because I think that learning itself is like it's a very good thing, and the learning or the experience sharing aspect of this experience that you're having, or like whatever, when you meet people in Korea, is all very positive. But what having the podcast element of it to me in some aspect is signifying is that there is a way in which, you know, the way that perhaps our generation, our brains are wired, or the way that productivity is kind of, you know, revered in the sort of like society that we live in, means that the learning is facilitated, or people are more willing to engage in the learning when it is attached to the creation and production of something that is then distributed on a platform for other people to consume. I feel like that signifies something about the way that, you know, we engage with information, conversation, ideas themselves in this sort of like platform era where everything, you know, ideas, thoughts, training, all of these things have become things that you can sort of like, you know, commodify and then produce and then sell to other people, which isn't necessarily what I'm saying is happening here, but it's just something that
But don't you think that that's a healthy development, or you think that's maybe an unhealthy development? Because my perspective is like, if you look at, let's say, the past, maybe before the podcasting stuff started, is that in order to get your voice heard or tell your story, there were very high barriers to entry, because you couldn't just start your own broadcasting network, right? Like that's a very expensive thing. And the fact that there are a lot more independent people having conversations with other people, and the fact that the barrier to entry is so low now, they provide a lot of alternatives to people, and to me that seems like a pretty constructive thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's like the whole thing about the internet, right? Is that like it causes democratization, but democratization is not necessarily always equalization. So democratization is you know, it does expand the point of access to a larger number of people. So, you know, from aristocracy to a more quote unquote, like the democratized free capitalist system is kind of like the traditional, you know, societal structural shift that we're seeing. And the internet is like another example of like democratization. But the sort of unintended often side effect of democratization is that democratization, you know, then platforms the things that we unconsciously maybe biased towards already, and trends or biases in society that people are not really engaging critically with become amplified under democratization. That's like that's like the classic reason why, you know, that's the classic logic that like the aristocracy uses against democratization, right? Is that you don't want like all these riffraff to like have their, and that's like a very elitist way of using that logic, but there's also, I think there is a way that we can critically engage with the ideas that, like, okay, why is it that we value specifically productivity, production, and consumption so much in our society? Is there a benefit towards actually revering the act of learning and conversation when it's not attached to production and consumption? What are the kinds of experiences that we're able to have when they are outside of spaces where we are actively producing things for other people to look at and comment on and share? And I don't necessarily, I think there are like pros and cons here, right? Like you're saying, like learning publicly creates a forum, and that is something that exists, but it's like, why is it that this forum is the forum that, we are choosing to engage with? Who are the people that necessarily have access to a network like this? Like, what is it about, coming to Korea, for example, where there is like this wealth of lived experience that is going to be very different from you and I's, but like necessarily this podcast will platform people that have a specific kind of experience or a specific kind of network. What is lost in that kind of practice or engagement? I again, not really making a normative take on this, but I think for me, at least, I guess the core of this is kind of that, like the podcasting era, like you're saying, is a symptom of the fact that information has been democratized in the internet era. But what you also see with podcasts is that because of this democratization, the new king is actually like it's things that get clicks, rage bait often, things that are easily palatable. I feel like there's a lot of anti-intellectualism in the sort of like podcasting narrative industry because legacy media feels overly intellectual or elitist. I mean, and those are perhaps valid critiques at times, but also has contributed to this sort of rising sentiment that we normal people don't need to listen to the opinions of people who have like studied certain things for a really long time. And that's a kind of democratization that shows that there is like a natural desire perhaps amongst a lot of people to it's also just a symptom, like people are frustrated with like the status quo, with the existing elitism. It's perhaps being expressed in not so productive ways, but that's like an example of how democratization, I think, can enhance certain societal biases that are perhaps things that we do have a capacity as a society to engage with more critically, but then in the case where everyone is just trying to push things out, make content, that kind of falls to the wayside. Because, engaging with those things critically takes a lot of time, like self-reflection. You have to read a lot. You have to talk to a lot of people with different opinions than yours. You have to sit in discomfort. When you're only thinking about producing, those things kind of fall to the wayside. This is not really, this is like, it seems like a separate conversation, but like.
No, I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting that you frame it as production consumption dynamic, because I do think that is one lens at which to look at the podcasting industry. But usually from an individual perspective, just as a podcaster, usually I'm just looking at it as like, how do I have an interesting conversation, understand the other person from the experiences that they've had, and learn as much in the process, right? So it's not really this like consumption production framing. Whereas I do think that there are other podcasters who definitely look at it through that lens. But I'm not so sure I really like agree with that premise that some podcasters are just like, they're doing it out of an individual passion or pursuit because they enjoy having conversation and want to share those conversations with other people that they think could also benefit from listening to somebody talk.
Like I think that, so I'm not really assigning intention to this, in saying that it isn't really about you or anyone else, actually, because it's like there are less ethical ways to engage with any medium or format, and there are more ethical ways to engage with any medium and format. But what I'm saying is that, like, in the actual act of using this medium or format to have the conversation, there is an element that is inextricable from the medium and the format. And so you could have these conversations outside of the sort of whatever system or infrastructure of like this podcast is, and there are things that would be lost and things that would be gained. But I do think that the way that this sort of like infrastructure has taken over the media landscape so quickly has perhaps led to a lack of critical engagement with what the actual format and the medium means. And yeah, I mean, like, obviously I know that you have conversations with people outside of all of this infrastructure all of the time. But so I'm not saying that you as a person are seeing it in this way, but I am saying that like podcasting as a format itself is a reflection of the fact that we, in the internet era, think of pretty much everything as something that can be produced and then distributed and consumed, and that like beforehand, like that wasn't true. Like that it wasn't true that you could have a conversation with someone and it was something that you could make and then put on the internet and people would watch, and that's like in and of itself is significant. I think it signals a change in the way that we engage with people and society and ideas and all of these things. And I'm not really necessarily saying that like you specifically or any other podcaster specifically is engaging with that in a specifically production and consumption oriented way. But I am saying that it is significant in that I think it reflects the fact that the way we think about information in the internet age is now production and consumption oriented, whether you or I like that or not. It is just a reality.
Yeah, maybe this isn't the most apt analogy because there are certainly some differences, but even with the democratization of like the printing press, for example, and people's literacy rates and their ability to publish their own works, like to me that's a healthy thing for the generation of ideas and being exposed to new things. And I feel like there are certainly trade-offs of people with maybe less developed views or views that are dangerous to society can also be expressed. But to me, that trade-off seemed like a healthy thing. I view podcasting, I think the medium is quite different because literacy is very different from visual, just having a conversation. But to me, I see some benefits in a similar sense as well, is that anybody can share their ideas, their thoughts, their experiences through podcasting. And it's not just kind of centralized forms of networks that have amassed power and distribution channels. To me, that seems like a pretty cool thing as well.
I feel like democratization, I think like lowering access barriers is something that I think is generally has been positive over history. And like I said, I think there are positive things here. I would say that the main difference is that the printing press, as the change that it affected in society, was directly disruptive to the most hegemonic system of power that existed. And I would say that the production of information and conversation itself is not disruptive to the most hegemonic system of power in our current society, which I would say is capitalism. And again, I don't really want to have like a normative take on this, but sure. I think the reality of what the age of like platform capitalism is and the information era of capitalism is that we have found more and more ways, more and more efficiently, to capitalize on information, and digital technology has made that more possible. And the way that podcasts have existed in the sort of like internet zeitgeist, and this is not really specific to this podcast at all whatsoever, but it is yeah. It is like reflective of kind of like the way that like podcasting has become a kind of rival to legacy media, or the way that we kind of fill every second of our days with information consumption. And information consumption is not only monetizable by the creators, but becomes data that goes on the internet that is then like scraped by AI machines, and then that takes up an immense amount of resource and is largely unregulated, and is then sort of like cannibalizing itself and reproducing information. Those are all things that I don't know. And this is also something that I'm not like a media scholar, so I'm kind of like, I don't really know if I have a very well-informed take on this that I can share right now. Maybe if I read a little bit more about it, I could. But it is something that I feel like feels perhaps different in that way to the printing press, because democratization of the printing press as a sort of like ideological system was directly revolutionary in that aspect. But I would say that democratization here is not actually the kind of like ideological revolution that it would have been in that time period in the same way. And there are ways, in fact, that I think, the proliferation of producing information to put on the internet is kind of the amplification or intensification of how information is created, used, and traded in the era of like platform capitalism, you know, the era of like information capitalism, digitization of information, all of these things. But again, I don't even know if I like this should go in the podcast. I'm like, feels so like, I'm like, also I don't really know that much about media theory of the present moment right now to I think really give an informed take on this. So please take these opinions with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I think that's the one difference about, I mean, to your point, right, is like in terms of podcasting as a form of expressing ideas and digesting ideas versus the written word. When I sit down to write anything, it is a lot more of an arduous process than just having a conversation. And it's because there's some sort of like permanence to the things that I write. And even to generate those ideas and to express them clearly takes so much time and effort. So I do think that writing literacy is a much more intellectual pursuit than just conversation. So I do see that there's differences in the mediums as well, but it's complicated.
Yeah, I would say also like the analogy is historically complicated also by the fact that like along with the printing press came the additional intellectual revolution of the time, which was that you started to write in plain English, and that was a huge break from the past. So basically, like everyone who was reading prior to that at the time would have been trained in Latin because they were part of the clergy or they were these like scholars basically who, you know, I guess like somewhat similar in Korea to the transition from Hanja to Hangul. But what is inherent to that is kind of this idea that the actual act of thought does not actually need to be sequestered or sort of separated elite along this sort of like aristocratic, you know, feudalistic system of information sharing. Whereas I feel like the transition that's happened with the internet and also like podcasting specifically is not really like, podcasting is not actually a new technology. It's like the new technology existed and then this is kind of an expression of that new technology that is coming a bit after the fact. And that to me feels perhaps more like an amplification of the logic that is already existing with this new technology rather than something like the printing press, in which the technology itself fomented a ideological revolution or an intellectual revolution in terms of the way that people were engaging with how you actually spread and understand ideas. And so podcasting in a lot of ways is actually just kind of like there have been a lot of iterations to get us to this point where you're like, you know, there's the internet and then there's like audiovisual format and then there's like radio hosting and then this is kind of like the end of the line in some ways. And so I guess that's why perhaps the analogy doesn't like exactly click, but I agree in that like I think there is also for people who and this also might just be because I am not the kind of person who particularly enjoys podcasts. Like I like don't really super see some of the benefits, but I also would generally agree that like democratization of information in a lot of capacity has been like useful, and the printing press is a good example of this. The internet also I think is a good example of this, and I'm not super like necessarily don't really want to catastrophize like, oh, the internet caused this and this and this to happen, but yeah, anyway.
Well, I mean, obviously like this is part of why I enjoy podcasting, is because people with very different experiences, very different backgrounds, whether they're like political or even ideological or just divergent viewpoints, like it's healthy for me to get exposed to them, and I think that's fun. Maybe before we continue down that
rewind
that dialogue, what you're doing in Korea, who you are.
Yes. Did not introduce myself. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about who you are?
So my name is Clara. I am Korean American. So I grew up in New York City my whole life. Basically, I was born in Boston, but we moved when I was like 1 or 2. So I don't really consider myself a Bostonian. Although I guess maybe people will see this in the comments and be like, you're not a real New Yorker. I went to just public school in New York my whole life. And then, my parents are both Korean immigrants. My dad moved here in 1980 after the military coup. He has a very interesting story, which we spoke about briefly, I think, last time, or maybe at length. I don't know. I talk a lot. He moved in 1980 alone because his older siblings are much older than him, and so they didn't really like have enough money to send his siblings when they were younger. And then by the time they could send my dad, his siblings were already like grown and making money or whatever. So they were in school or something, college or something. And then so my dad moved in 1980 alone. He like lived with a far distant relative in LA near Oakland for a while. And then she got sick, so she went to like a old folks home or something like that, or hospital. And then he just kind of like lived in the apartment on his own. He told me this, he has this story about how he knew that this other Korean family was like getting evicted, so he like got them to move in with him in this like one bedroom apartment. And the exchange was that they would like cook for him because he didn't like know how to do anything because he was 13. And then they would be on, if people came around and checked, there would be like adults in the house and everything. So that's kind of how he like made it. He like hacked it, living in California. He didn't speak any English. And then he went to Stanford, studied economics, went to MIT, did his PhD there in economics, and then became a pastor. So I think I told you about this. He's kind of an unusual man. He became Christian at Stanford and was kind of interested in the philosophy of the inherent value in human life, outside of the kind of success story that he had. So he has this very like, prototypical, archetypal American dream story, right? But I think in his experience, it was kind of like the value of him as a person depended on kind of the amount of success that he was able to produce. So again, this theme of production or success inside of our society. And then I think he did like VC or something in the .com bubble. This is like in the 90s. So like before, he made like a good amount of money on that. I think he lost most of it, is what the story is. But after that, he graduated his PhD program and then took the money that he had made, what was left over the money he had made, and seeded this church in Cambridge, which is why I was born in Boston. And so this church was also for what he saw as kind of like secular minded individuals who were very intelligent and kind of had become, they lived secularly a lot of the time because they had issues with the sort of institutional history of the church, or which is very complicated. And I would say, especially in the States and oftentimes in Korean American communities, inflicts a lot of violence on communities, but at the same time had kind of become stuck inside of this success as the measure of human value, as the measure of self-value, really, this kind of self ideology. And then he started the church there in Cambridge for these kind of people. He does a lot of like close reading of the original Hebrew in the Bible, thinking about the intellectual history of Christianity and how it is to adopt the values of connection and fulfillment and living a fuller life for the 21st century. And then the idea was to do something the church grew pretty quickly, and then the idea was to do something similar in New York City, which is also a very secular place. So that's why I grew up in Manhattan. And my mom immigrated in the 90s, so she was in her mid-20s. My parents both met in the States, so this is also, why, I'll get to this later, I guess, but I didn't grow up speaking Korean at all. So this is why, because my mom had lived in America for about 5 years by the time she met my dad. And then my dad had been in America since he was 14, right? So 13, 14. So he had already, I think, naturalized by the time he had naturalized when he was like in his mid 20s. So yeah, by the time he met my mom, he was like an American citizen. And so they met, and then they got married and had me, obviously. I have two younger siblings, so my younger siblings don't speak much Korean still. And the large part of the reason is like, I think actually someone spoke about this on this panel podcast before. I don't know, actually. One parent, one language. I don't know if someone has talked about this before.
No, I don't think so.
But this is like the new linguistic child psychology, is that when you teach a child multiple languages, you need to make the context of the situation in which you use each language very, very stable. Otherwise, the kid will think that the two languages are one language because they have no reason to believe that Korean and English are two different languages, for example. So in a case like my family, it's like my parents are both very fluent in English and in Korean. So my understanding, they tried to teach me Korean, but what you should do really is have one parent speak one language only and one parent speak one language only, because then the kid is able to differentiate that when I talk to this parent, there are these, for example, like grammatical structures that are different. When I talk to this parent, there are these grammatical structures that are different. And then that becomes kind of like instinctive, and then the kid can actually communicate. But if you don't make the context really stable, what happens is like the child just thinks that the language is just unstable. So you just like learn all of these words and grammatical structures at once. But then, and when you think about it, it makes sense, because like, why would the kid know that like there is such a thing as multiple languages in the world, and like that you would necessarily differentiate between the grammatical structures of, because your parents are speaking both interchangeably. Then it's like, so that's like I don't know when this became more like common knowledge, but this is like very common knowledge in like child linguistic psychology these days. So like parents these days who are trying to raise their kids bilingual, like, will stick to this very firmly, and it works a lot better. And so the reason that a lot of immigrant kids, Korean American kids, will understand Korean a lot of the time, but not speak it is, or they understand Korean and can speak it, is because the parents actually usually are not able to speak English. So the child then quickly realizes that like outside of the house, so this becomes like a locational stability. So there's also this other strategy, is like in-house, out-house. So like when you're inside the home, you only speak one language, and then when you're outside the home, you only speak another language. And then the kid can attach the context of like this, in this environment, like locational environment, like my non-family members, I use this language, and in this location with my family members, I use this language. And so with, I guess, a lot of Korean American kids, often what happens too is that like they can understand that they outside of the home, like with not their parents, they have to speak a different language, and with their parents they speak one language. But then because we learn so much language from our peers, when you start to go to school, English becomes the natural, but then you can understand things at home.
That makes sense.
But what happened with me was that my parents just kind of gave up, because I wasn't so what happens actually with a lot of these kids is that they start speaking really late, because it's like the logic of the two languages is not the same. Obviously there's like different, the languages have different internal logic. So the kids just won't talk until later, and then a lot of the times they'll start talking in like more full sentences, for example. So I didn't speak until I was a little bit older, and then they sent me to daycare or something at some point, and then I just started like talking full sentences all the time in English. And so they were like, okay, it's better she can say anything at all than say nothing in neither language. So
so like very early on, like when you were first born, they were trying to speak
they
both?
tried yeah.
Okay.
I think they tried to teach us, also because my grandparents, they don't speak English, but I'm the oldest, so this is why also I had the most exposure of my siblings. But by the time I was like 2, I think they had given up, and they're just so very fluent in English. Most people, when they meet them, think that they are Korean American. They have very little to no accent. And then I started watching Korean dramas when I was 14. It was so funny. I had a Chinese friend at school, in high school, and she was watching this Korean drama called Healer, and she recommended it to me, and I watched it. I was like so obsessed with Ji Chang-wook, and so I like wanted to watch everything that he was in. And it's actually really funny, I would watch all of these things on Drama Fever. I don't know if any of you know Drama Fever. And it's funny because I just met the person who the founder of Drama Fever. He runs a Korean drama entertainment company in Korea right now. So I had a meeting with him yesterday. Really cool guy. But he like seriously, Drama Fever was like, I watched Running Man, watched all these Korean dramas, Pinocchio, all these Korean dramas on Drama Fever. And then it came back to me pretty quickly. Like I had become conversationally fluent in like a year or two by just watching dramas. And then I took like formalized class at Yale when I went to university. So for the first time, that was when I took a Korean class, and I got something called the Light Fellowship, which is like a scholarship that Yale offers for East Asian language study. And then I studied here in the summer of 2019. And then during COVID, and this is kind of how I ended up back in Korea, I entered for this company, this Korean drama company here in Korea, and I mostly did translation and interpretation for them. So this was at the time that HBO was trying to expand into Asia. They sort of like and didn't have enough money and eventually left. But Disney Plus also sort of first came into the region at that time, and so and obviously Disney Plus stuck around. So I would, but at that time the HBO team and the Disney team didn't really have Korean speakers because they hadn't really hired like local talent quite yet. So I would do interpretation for them, and a lot of the time it was like also translating synopses and that kind of thing and sending over deliverables. And then I ended up enjoying working in the industry. I stayed for the full year. So I ended up taking a full year off, and I was a line producer on a drama called Times, which was an OCN drama. It didn't do very well, but the director was actually the director of what's the English name? 선제업 부처? Lovely Runner. If you've heard of that one did really well. The director of Lovely Runner, he was the director of Times. He was very sweet to us. That was his first project as a director. So he's kind of come a long way since then. And then after that, I was a producer a 제작 producer. So I didn't do development, but I did production on the production side of things for this drama called The King's Affection, which was a KBS Netflix drama. And that drama is where I met this director called Song Hyun-wook 감독님. And Song Hyun-wook 감독님 is well known here. His most famous work is called 또 오해영, so Another Miss O. That was really famous. It came out in like 2012. That one did really well. But The King's Affection did pretty well as well. He did the drama version of Beauty Inside. What else has he done? 연애 말고 결혼. He is like well known here. So I met him on that project. We're different parts, right? So I was production, he was direction. So I was part of the production company that was producing this drama, and then he was the director that was like hired basically by the production team to direct this project. So we would interact quite a lot, but we were like separate. He was not my boss necessarily. And then I ended up having to leave before we wrapped shooting because I had to go back to Yale. But he had always been like, oh, you should come back and work for me. And I was like, yeah, okay, whatever, because he's a director. So if I were to work for him, it would be as like a 연출부, so like in the direction team of a set. But like in the Korean system, being a 연출부, like 막내, is really a lot of just like, you're just like running around a lot. You're like stopping cars from driving by, that kind of thing. It's very like physical work, which is also like what being a line producer is. But I kind of was like, after this experience, I was more interested in doing writing or that kind of thing. So I went back to Yale and I finished my degree in English literature. I ended up going to Oxford for my master's, which I guess we can, after this, talk about my educational background a little bit, where I studied world literature. And then I learned while I was at Oxford that this director, Song Hyun-wook, had founded his own production studio called Studio Bom he had like gotten some investment from this other big company here in Korea. And he kept telling me to come back, and he was like, you can do what you want. You can, do production, or you can do development, or, have projects for you that you could do, would work well for you here. And at the time I was still considering going back to do my PhD, or staying in the UK or going back to the States to do my PhD. But I told him that I would come back for at least a year and see how it was. So I actually recently just turned down a PhD offer because I have decided to stay a bit longer. Partly because I'm in charge of the development of a drama right now, and I would like to see that to filming before I leave, so just get my name on something. And then I also am, as we've talked about before, working on a short film of my own based off of a short story that I wrote for Asymptote Journal, which is a literary magazine that is actually probably like one of the most famous ones in specifically the Korean literary translation scene. They don't publish as much fiction, like so original fiction, but I was one of 2 original fiction pieces published in their last edition, which came out in April. So yeah, I work here now as a development producer. Our office is in Deokundong, which is just right outside of it's in Goyang, so just right outside of Seoul, but right next to Sangam-dong. So that's Sangam is like where Digital Media City is, like where all of the 제작사 and broadcasters are. So it's like Yeouido, Sangam is like where a lot of them are. KBS, JTBC, all of the TVN, all of these places, NBC. And yeah, I like my day-to-day is that I work with a lot of writers and directors to develop the IP that we've either bought or that writers are developing as original pieces, and take scripts, edit them, send them back, have meetings with writers, and then on the side there's a lot of like meeting new people, drinking with them, working on my own film. So yeah, that's who I am. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I was a little bit nervous to have this type of conversation, but also very excited, is because like I've watched very little K-dramas.
Right. Yeah.
And I know very few people in the K-drama industry, partly because I don't speak Korean, so it's kind of hard to have extended conversations with people.
Yeah.
And so in having our last chat, we spoke for maybe like 2 or 3 hours, right? And it was just like a download of a bunch of very interesting information, especially when it comes to just like the development of Korean media, whether it's like K-pop, K-drama. You have read a lot of like history on that as well,
right?
You know? And so I found that quite interesting. So I'll ask you more on that front, but also when you were describing the kind of your upbringing and I guess your relationship to Korea and your parents' relationship to Korea as well. You had said that basically you ended up learning Korean language through K-dramas at 14, right? Your, I guess, like exposure to Korean culture in like your early teens and like throughout your adolescence, like did you come to Korea regularly and was like maybe living and working in Korea as you matured something that was always on your radar? Like, can you explain that a little bit? Yeah,
so I would say that I am okay, the one thing I would say about myself is that I don't think I didn't have an upbringing that I think most Korean Americans on the East Coast do. So I didn't grow up in a Korean American community whatsoever. I actually didn't like know any Korean Americans in school at all, basically. There was like maybe one girl in elementary school and like 1 or 2 people in my high school, but it was not like, because most Koreans don't live in New York City, in Brooklyn or Manhattan. So I went to public school in Manhattan for elementary and middle school, and then I went to public school in Brooklyn for my high school education. But most Koreans communities are either in Queens, which there is a little bit there, but I think even these days it's like mostly New Jersey. So it's like there isn't a lot of. I actually remember I registered late for an SAT, and then for my SAT, and then I had to go to New Jersey because I had like all of the spots in New York had filled up. So because we live on the west side near the river, so I could just like take the train and go into New Jersey. And I remember like I had to take the train to New Jersey and then go up to, I don't even know where that area is, where all the Koreans live in New Jersey. I went to this high school, and in this high school, it's like there were all these like this plaque of this names, and all the names were like Kim, Lee, Choi. I thought it was crazy. I was like, oh my god, there are so many Korean people here. But like, so and then also my parents, my dad's church is not a Korean church. It's he preaches in English, and it's like fully multicultural, multi-ethnic, multinational. So in my when I was in America, it was very like I was Asian American, but I was very like around American people, and I like had Asian American friends, but it was not like, it was like we were Asian American, but it wasn't like we were Korean American, or we spoke the same language at home. I had a lot of like Chinese American friends, some of whom spoke Cantonese and some of whom spoke Mandarin. My high school was very diverse, like ethnically and racially. So it was like a huge range of like different backgrounds in my high school. The high school is actually very interesting. I think right now it's not doing so well, but at one point it had a very interesting mission. I went to this school called the Brooklyn Latin School. No one's ever heard of it, but it is an interesting school. So if anyone wants to like look it up, it's like an interesting school.
Why do you say it's interesting?
So the Brooklyn Latin School it's a public school. It's a specialized high school in New York. I don't really know if like the specialized high school system. I'm not going to go into because it's like overly complicated to explain. But it was the specialized high schools in New York with the lowest cutoff score, and so you had to take a test to get in, but it was like not difficult to get in necessarily. But they offered at the time I was attending IB for all, and so the International Baccalaureate program is like unusual to take in the U.S. in the first place, and it's like this public school, and it was of the specialized high schools in New York like by far the most racially and socioeconomically diverse, and it was founded by this guy who had like a very specific vision about providing like this sort of like classic education in a Brooklyn high school, public high school. And so a lot of our classes were like very seminar oriented, and we took Latin for 4 years, and we would do this thing called like public declamation 4 times a year. So they would like have students in front of the entire school, like an assembly, memorize like a passage from a famous monologue or a famous speech, and then give it in front of the whole school. And a lot of our classes were graded on declamation or seminars, so we sort of had to speak often. And but it wasn't like, the name obviously comes from the Boston Latin School, which is like a very famous school, but it's not, obviously it wasn't like the Boston Latin School in a lot of ways. But yeah, it's an interesting school. It was only like 4 years old when I went there, so yeah. And then I think people always think that it's Brooklyn Tech when I mention it, but I'm like, no, it's not Brooklyn Tech.
Did you want to go to that school, or did your parents want you to go to that school? Like,
no, my parents are very like hands-off educationally. My mom kind of doesn't super believe in like private schooling, just like ideologically. She was her whole thing was kind of like, you guys as kids are like, smart and socially adjusted, and you can like do fine in a public education system without like additional help or resources, and that's like a great privilege that you have, and I see no reason to like go through this whole like rigmarole of you apply to all these private schools or whatever.
Yep.
But the way that like public education works in New York City is that a lot of the schools are not zoned, so you actually like have to like request to go to certain schools. And so when you're like in 8th grade, they, at the time, I think it's online now, but at the time they would give you this like big book, and you would like share it with your classmates, and then it had like every high school in New York City. You could like choose, and which you would look through them, and the way it works is like you can choose to, so there are like non-district regular public high schools where they would like, you would send like a transcript, and then it would be a lottery, so you would like, they would check your grades or whatever, and then of the students they would just like pick at random. There's like a 50% or whatever. So that's like Millennium, Eleanor Roosevelt, like Lab, like these kinds of schools. And then performing arts high schools, you have to take a audition for, and these are all also public schools, so like LaGuardia, Frank Sinatra, PPAS. LaGuardia is very famous, obviously. That's where like Timothy Chalamet and Saul Al Gore, all these people went. And then there's the private schools, which you obviously like is separate, and then there are the specialized high schools, which you like take a standardized test for, and then it's like ranking, it's like med school ranking. So like depending on the number of people who rank number 1 this school, like the cutoff is determined by like the lowest score of the person who like can fill the last spot at that school has to offer. So the school that is the most difficult to get into in the specialized high school system is called Stuyvesant. That school is also very famous. And then the second most difficult is Brooklyn Tech. Brooklyn Latin at the time of its founding was 4 years old, so the cutoff was very low. And so what ended up happening was there were a lot of like students who like didn't do test prep necessarily, but like were very motivated and like interested by like what this kind of education had to offer. And then so that was why this school was very socioeconomically and racially diverse, whereas like Stuyvesant is like, the statistic is like 75% East Asian, for example, because it's like race blind test admissions. And then like, for example, like in a lot of like Koreatowns and Chinatowns in New York City, you have these like test centers crop up. So there's like a lot of cultural infrastructure for this kind of like to, that sends attends a lot of these sort of like Asian American city schools. The school, I think the reason I had known about it was because like one of the teachers in my middle school had like heard that there was this specific guy who had like founded this school, who had made this school and had like this very specific vision, and she knew that I was like very humanities oriented and was kind of like, oh, maybe it would be interesting for you to look at the school. And then I went, and I didn't really like think about it that much, so I ended up taking the test. I didn't prepare for it at all, and then I just put that school first because like my teacher had said it. And then I had gotten into the school, and I went and looked at it, and it's a small school. It was a small school, and the teachers seemed passionate. I think also because especially at that time it still had this kind of like startup vibe. So that was why I ended up going, but obviously I was like a child, so I didn't really, it's like luck of the draw in some ways. Like there's a lot of like random factors that caused me to end up going to the school, and me and my siblings and I all went to different schools because the New York system is like this. So my brother went to a school called Eleanor Roosevelt, which is on the Upper East Side. It's a non-district public high school. And then my sister went to this school called Lab, which is like in the East Village, and it's also like a non-zoned public high school.
I have no idea about how complicated the New York high school system works. That's quite wild.
It's a huge district as well. It's like the biggest in the country. There are like thousands of schools in just like New York City.
So like as you were saying, very unusual Korean American upbringing.
Oh,
like,
yes.
Your parents didn't speak any Korean to you.
Yeah.
You learned Korean through mostly watching K-dramas. Right.
So,
and then even at high school, there weren't like you weren't a part of any Korean American communities.
Right. Yeah. So for me, it was like when I was growing up, I kind of just had like a New York experience. Like I would say I was like a New Yorker. And like obviously that is inextricable from like things like race, gender, and culture. But like it wasn't like I found that when I got to university, there were a lot of Korean Americans who had these experiences that they would talk about, and they would be like, oh, I can relate to that. And I would have so like Korean church or like certain kinds of like pop culture or foods or things like this, like that, those are, or like stores that they all shopped at, or like these kind, like we didn't have an H Mart in New York until like I was like 12 or 13. So that was like a new thing, right? For growing up in New York. I had like this New York conglomerate like Asian American experience, so like going to 99 Favor, and like we would get like five boba guys, and like we would go play billiards in like Chinatown. This was like the kind of things that I did, but that was with my like Asian American friends growing up. And then we did go to Korea, so we went to Korea relatively often. I would say it's like a huge privilege. Both my parents are the only ones to have immigrated in their entire families, which is also unusual, that they just like both happened to be individuals who left and then met in America, and then all of their families still lived in Korea. And my dad especially is on like the earlier wave of immigration because he left when he was so young. So like at the time, for example, when he was at Stanford or MIT, there were no Korean people. But both sets of my grandparents, all my aunts and uncles, everyone lives in Korea. So we would come back every so often when we could. And so my experience with Korean culture was very Korean. It was like very much not Korean American, or a lot of Korean American kids interact with Korea through like the memories of their parents, or through their immigrant communities. For me, it was like these two worlds were very separate. It was like in America, we didn't speak any Korean at home. Like my parents would use Korean when they were like trying to have a conversation when they didn't want us to understand what they were talking about. That's like the level to which the three of us could not understand Korean. Like I didn't know beyond like 안녕하세요, 감사합니다. That was like the extent of my Korean. And when we would be in Korea, I remember as a child it being very disorienting often, like the kinds of things that I would get praised for in like the American school system, like being very outspoken or having a lot of ideas or being very chatty, I would have to be quieter in Korea. And those were things that were difficult to adjust to. Even at the time, I remember this one time my mom got yelled at on the subway by this like older Korean guy because he was like upset with her for not teaching us the language. So me and my siblings were like chattering away in English. And I don't think this happens as much anymore, actually, because I think Korea as a society has like become, actually like genuinely the attitude has become more global, and like there's more of an understanding or an acceptance of like the kinds of different experiences that exist in like a fully integrated global modern economy. But I would say 15 years ago, maybe, like there would sometimes be people who would like look at us on the street or in the elevator, and that doesn't really happen anymore. Like these days there's so many foreigners in Korea. Like even compared to 5 years ago, I would say that there are so many more in Korea now. So you know, growing up, this was one thing. Like when I went to university for the first time, I was kind of like, oh, like I feel like my experiences don't really match up in some ways. Like I think also my experience with Korea was very direct and immediate in some ways. I also had and my mom has like a complicated relationship, I think, to like Confucianism specifically, in the ways that like patriarchy exists in Korea. And this was something that like I think she did a good job of like articulating to me from a very young age about like, you know, there are these societal and structural factors that exist in this culture, and that's why people might think of you in this way, and that's something that I personally find really difficult, and that's like part of the reason why I left. And those things, you know, she has a very clear eye towards, and the capacity to articulate very objectively, like without emotion necessarily. And so I think for me also, like I had a sense also more of like, and saw firsthand a lot of the flaws that still existed in Korean society, and like reasons why my parents might have left and have chosen to live in America. But because of that, when I was a kid, when I was younger, I never imagined that I would come back and live here. Like that was really out of the question. And I really think that if it hadn't been for COVID, I don't think I would have come and lived here. So like for me, another thing is that I like to talk, and I am a literature student. I mean, you can tell. And I studied literature and the history of like literature culture through Yale and then at Oxford as well. And I think articulation is probably the main, in some ways, tool, but maybe sometimes crutch that I use to make myself known to other people and to understand other people. And Korea is, one, a very high context culture, and two, my Korean language ability, especially at the time that I first moved here, was so much poorer comparatively. And so I don't know that if it hadn't been for COVID, I would have been like, oh yeah, I could like come work here, or like this is something that I would do. And when I first got here, like because I was doing translation work, like obviously that's like something that other people can't do necessarily, but I feel like when the first couple of months were difficult because I felt dumb like all the time, which is like is fine, right? But
it's
I was
part
like,
of the process, right?
I mean, it was difficult because it was like this huge part of the way that I had become accustomed to understanding other people and getting to know other people was just like not available to me at all anymore. So I think I became a lot more observant in those first few months. Like I would observe a lot more how I could understand social interactions and see how people thought about the world through watching how they interacted with other people, and listening very closely. And it was also just like mentally exhausting, like to focus all the time to understand what's being said. But then, you know, within like 6 months or so, I had adjusted, and by the time that I was working on the set of those two projects, I could kind of like not be focusing anymore and would understand what was being said to me. My reading had improved a lot because it was so much like reading and writing and texting, because we so much of what the work we do is over the phone. We would like send reports of like what was going on set over our like internal group chat, and so, you know, I had to be able to craft those messages and send them as well, which is at first very difficult and nerve-wracking. And, you know, also I think in some ways like you get used to like being fluent in your own language, and then you think, oh, maybe like for some, you know, there's a kind of like a fight or flight thing where it's like you're bad at the new language and then you think the world's going to end, but it doesn't. So then you're like, okay, actually it's fine. And I think this is very, very different in that like I came back here to work, and it's different in that like I wasn't an immigrant with no family and with no money. Like I had support and all of these things. And so I think it's like very different from the kind of immigration story that a lot of our parents have. But like at that time, I remember thinking at times like it must have been so mentally exhausting for my parents to like move to the States for those first few years and like not understand anything and just be like kind of lost. And I remember feeling kindredness to them at that time. And so that was COVID. And, you know, I had I studied post-colonial literature at Yale, and I've always loved literature and stories and writing, and I love understanding culture through stories. Like I think storytelling is one of the ways. I mean, this is not revolutionary. This is like very Raymond Williams structures of feeling, but I think stories can show us the currents of the way that our society and our culture thinks before we have developed the capacity to articulate it in a sort of like systemic or theoretical way. But I was always sort of this like very, you know, type A, like good kid. So I was like, oh, I'll like do English literature because I love it, but then I'll like go to law school or something, right? Because that was like what I knew I could be good at that, and like that was more school. And then like once you like graduate the school, you like take the bar, and then you like get hired somewhere, and then you like work there. Like that's like it was a very clear and obvious path to take. And then I remember COVID happening, and I think for the first time I was like, oh, I actually have like no control over anything that happens in my life. And that was very healthy for me. I think it was like a good moment to realize. I mean, also like I had no control in that. Like I believe that most of the things in my life are so circumstantial, like the experiences that I get to have and the education that I got to have, like all of these things to me feel very much like a luck of the draw. And I was aware of that, but I think still kind of had this like feeling that I needed to, you know, optimize for the outcomes or figure out what the next step was going to be to, you know, do justice to this like these great opportunities that had been given to me and all of these things. And then COVID happened, and it was like, well, actually the whole world can just stop, and that has literally nothing to do with me. And then also like I was like, okay, this seems like an opportunity to like take a step back when everyone else also is taking a step back in some ways. And I was lucky in that I was able to get an F4 visa, which is one of the visas that allows Korean descendants to work in Korea. And I was lucky in that I have family here, so I was able to stay with my family here. So I moved here, and then I was working for a little while, and I think it took a couple of years after that to sort of like grow the muscle of, you know, I had this idea of what my life was going to be, but I want to start, you know, trying to choose imagining a different outcome of what that might look like, and also just really like reckoning with the fact that like I have this education, like I don't need to make enough money to retire my parents, like I have family in Korea and other places that want to support me. Like those are all things that I think, you know, sometimes a lot of us have parents with experiences that are, you know, there was a lot of urgency or immediacy to like, oh, we need to survive. And then also like this is also something that our culture tells us, is that you need to like succeed to survive and make it in this world. But then, you know, in reality, and this is not true for a lot of people, but in my reality, it was that, you know, I could afford to take a risk, and that wasn't gonna like destroy my life. And I sort of like, you know, would think about that for the following 2 years before I graduated Yale. Then the reason I went to Oxford was because I do really love academia. Academia is not the right word. I love studying. I love thinking. And I think there's a kind of thinking and understanding of the world that happens in these academic spaces that I do enjoy. So a kind of reading of theory and spending all your time reading literature, like that's not something I can really do here because I am working and I'm busy. But I wanted to do the master's because first of all, world literature is a very interesting field of research in the literary space right now. And I think that fact that Oxford has this program, which is taught by some really, really brilliant and passionate professors, was interesting to me. But also because I'm in the process of getting something published with an academic journal right now. But if I wanted to go back later, it would kind of set me up for that. I wanted to also see if I could sort of take my interest in the Korean cultural production field and see if there was a way to engage with it sort of critically and rigorously in an academic way that hasn't really been done in English as much before or quite yet. And so I specifically was studying a lot of like the institutional and infrastructural history of Korean cultural production through the lens of world literature while I was at Oxford. And then I was like, okay, I'll do this, and then I'll come back and work for my director, and that will be the sort of like two like year-long experiences where I can, you know, decide how I want to make my choice in terms of like which direction I want to go in. And so for now, I've decided to stay here a bit longer to try and like 자리 잡아, create catch my foot. How do you say this in English? Get good footing in the industry here, and then make a decision after that if I want to go back to school or if I want to try and pivot to doing more international productions or whatever that is.
So when you had said that you had never even considered like living and working in Korea until the COVID situation. So the COVID situation was you were a student at Yale, and then COVID happens, and then you landed. Was this the fellowship that you landed while you were here, or what was this? How did you come to Korea just because COVID happened?
So basically, what happened? The light fellowship I did was in 2019, so that was before COVID. That was in the summer, so that was like the last summer before COVID, I guess. Coming back to Korea situation was COVID happened, so I finished out my spring of sophomore year on Zoom, and then I was kind of like, I don't really want to do this for another full year, because it was kind of at that point already looking like COVID was just gonna like keep on going for a while, which, you know, obviously it ended up being the case. And Korea at the time was, you may or may not know this, but it was very under control here. So it was only really around the time that the vaccines came out in America, the Korean situation had gotten a little bit worse. So like there were like a few hundred cases a day, maybe in the thousands on a bad day. But like back in the time when like COVID was really bad in the States, like in the summer and the second half of 2020, in Korea, it was like Seoul was like a couple of dozen cases a day at most. So like in a population of like 20 million in Gyeonggi-do, that's like really low. Like the chance of getting COVID is almost like nothing, right? So part of it was just that I was like, I had family here who were kind of like, oh, people are like actually just like going to work here. Like this is just, people are like wearing masks and like you know, being safe, but you know, people are going to work. And so part of it was just like, so I heard that and I was like, okay, maybe I should just go back to Korea and like live with my family for a little bit, because I don't really want to do Zoom school for a year. And you know, this is like a huge privilege. Like this was just kind of like a lot of people were kind of like needed to stay and be in school, and it was kind of like, for me, I was like, it's okay if I delay my graduation for a year, and I would rather try and have an experience in that time in a place where you know, things are okay. So and there were actually quite a few people who came back to Asia around that time. Like I remember this as well. So I came back and like I had to do this like quarantine in like a hotel for 2 weeks, and they wouldn't even like let us go outside the door. So you couldn't even like go in the hallway. So I just like stayed in this room for 2 weeks, and I would like try to like do push-ups on the floor by the end, because I was like, I feel like and I don't even like exercise, but I was like, I feel like my body is atrophying from just like sitting in this room.
Wow.
And then eventually at the end, and they would come every morning and every night, and they would like stick the PCR test up your nose. They would like have they're very, you know, they handled the situation very well here in Korea. And then I sort of like came in, and you know, I had my F4 visa, so I was like, you know, started working, and okay, so I came to Korea, and then someone I knew was like, oh, this company, you know, they could use someone who does like interpretation part-time, so why don't you just like go and be an intern for them? And I was like a college student at the time, so I was like, okay, yeah, so that seems like something that I could do. But like it wasn't like really, I wasn't really thinking about my career really that much, because at that time I was like, oh, maybe I'll go to law school. So this seemed like something fun and relatively related to what I study. So it's like, you know, I'm interested in culture industries. I study literature. I can translate Korean. I can interpret. So I went to work for this company, and it started off like the first 3 months, like that was really just what I was doing. And then eventually, when it seemed like the situation wasn't getting better, and also like I enjoyed the work and the environment, I asked if I could stay on a little bit longer until the end of the year. And then that was when I sort of became a line producer on a couple of these projects. So I was really, you know, I was going out and just like helping the older producers on the set with whatever they needed. But it was developmentally a good experience, I think, for a lot of reasons. Like I think one of the greatest takeaways for me was kind of that like I didn't really necessarily need to follow this like made up plan that I had come up with in my head. But also I think I had it was an experience where I think I really got to know a side of the culture and the people here that I wouldn't have otherwise. So just like Korean people who like live there their whole lives, who like work, and on a set there are all kinds of people. There are people who are just doing physical labor, like they're building the set and taking it down, or they're technical staff, and then there are people who just like move stuff. There are drivers, there are like there's all different kinds of people. And especially on the set of The King's Affection, I got to know like really everyone. And I think I also became very interested in the way that the entertainment industry infrastructurally moves here. It has a very touch and go culture still. It's a little bit like a startup. There's a lot of flexibility, and it's very, the way that things get done is very, it's very touch and go, despite the like very high quality of the things that get produced. It's not super formalized a lot of the time, the way that people do things, and everyone has their own style. And I think that was very interesting and attractive to me as well. And it was also just very interesting and attractive to me to sort of think about the ways that I fit in this space as like an outsider, and the huge amount of privilege that came with like me being associated with America and being in this place, but also the sort of difficulties that came with the language barrier, and how it was that I could be understood and make myself understood to people who have life experiences that are like fundamentally so different from mine, but also to people who like for whom I have a life experience that is like almost not imaginable, like from a place that many people have never been to, and with like parents and family that live lives that are totally different from the lives that people who grow up mostly in Korea live in. And I think that as a connective experience was really valuable for me.
As like somebody who doesn't speak Korean, but is like living in Seoul, like for myself, obviously that is something that I would like to do in terms of my understanding and access to the culture. For yourself, like the language level that you had when you first came to Korea, because you were doing translation work, right?
Yeah.
And then the language level that you got to, like how much development was there, and then also like how impactful or important was that to your understanding of the culture as well?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I also think that this is a slight tangent, but this in some ways I think relates to a trend that I sometimes see amongst Korean Americans that I think is a little bit misguided at times about the way that Korean Americans, or not misguided, but I think that there is a way in which Korean Americans often look at Korea as this place that is, they don't belong, or as an identity issue. And I think that part of the reason is because like the way that race relations and race discussion happens in America is often about identity, like about belonging. And there are historical reasons for this, and like this has a lot to do with critical race theory and like ways in which like Asian American like political movements have like happened historically. And I don't really want to get into that like fully, but there's a lot of nuance to that, and I understand why this happens. But I do think that Asian American as an identity is separate from Korea as a place, and this is like obviously a fact, and people I don't realize this, but the sense of like I don't belong in Korea, and the feeling of like displacement that comes from that, I think is sometimes misplaced. I don't belong in Korean society or in communities really, and in the way that like there's a sort of meta question here, like who really ever really belongs in any place or any society. I think most Korean people often feel very disjointed from their communities and like out of place a lot because like the way that modernization happened in Korea was so compressed and happened so quickly that even just like within family units there are a lot of like ideological disjointments between like how parents and children interact, and those are all factors that play into like a sense of misbelonging. But like even my reality here is that like I'm an American, and like I can interact very fluently in Korean with Koreans because I understand the culture very well now, and I understand the language very well. But that's not because there's like something in me that is like more Korean than other people. It's because understanding is a practice and a study, and like understanding a culture and a language is like anything else, is a practice and a study. And it will be uncomfortable at times, I think, because you will be very aware that you are not as comfortable or as fluent or as similar to the people around you. And Korea can be a more homogenous, culturally more homogenous place than, other places that some of us might be used to growing up in. But at the same time, it's like, part of being here is trying to understand like why it is that people think the way that they do, and I think what can be helpful helpful in some ways is once you are able to understand that, it's easier to separate from yourself that this is like why people interact with me in this way, because there are these sort of like historical or societal factors that shape the development of the way that people see the world in this way, and that might be the reason that they are more hostile to foreigners. And sometimes those reasons are very valid, sometimes they're not valid, and sometimes when you are able to communicate with those people at a higher level, then it changes also. And so I would say, like, to answer your question, like, I don't feel like I'm Korean, and that doesn't really bother me. When I first got here 4 years ago now, so I came here for a year and then went back. It was very obvious that I was not a Korean. Like, it was not like I could fully fluently have conversations with people, but reading took a really long time, and like there were a lot of words and vocabulary I didn't know. I had to look up. So like translation as a practice wasn't so difficult because it's like you have all the resources with you, and then interpretation wasn't so difficult either because it's like there aren't really super difficult concepts being thrown around. But I was not at a level that I would be able to participate in development. And I did in the first few months, I definitely did have to focus all the time. On set, that's like, I'm working like 12 hours a day. So 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. So that's like an intensive course every day, and like listening to other people and trying to communicate, and also trying to like understand other people, not just like literally, but just like trying to understand like why people might be frustrated with the situation at hand and helping them out. And part of what the production team does is like go between the staff and the director and the studio and try to gain, ask people for their understanding when we don't have the budget for something, and so that's a very human and a people oriented skill, and that interacting with people in that way gives you a lot of insight about like how it is that people think and why they think in those ways. And by the end of it, I would say that I was fluent to a degree where like I didn't really have to think about it anymore to like understand what was going on. So that was like a new level up, I think. And then I didn't touch Korean that much for the following few years. So I was kind of nervous coming back, but it's been, I came back and I've been surprising myself. Like I have been more fluent. I'm more fluent now than I was even when I first got here. So that's like 5 months ago. But I like debate writers on their writing every day, basically. And that's not that I'm not as eloquent as I am in English, but I like can hold my ground, and I'm not really saying like people need to be as good at Korean as I am, but I do think that there's a way in which sometimes it feels like there's this intrinsic barrier of like identity, or like I'm not going to belong, and that I think becomes a psychological barrier at times. But I really do think that a lot of the time the learning itself is really, it's like a study. It's like you can understand people better by studying culture and studying language, and that's like an everyday, like a lifelong practice in some ways. And it's funny too, because it's like that's what our parents do every day. Like our parents who immigrated, they have to understand, they have adapted to a different way of being. Really, it is a different way of being, living in a different country, living in a different culture. And I do think that engaging with people who live here and because they live here have totally different life experiences than I do, totally different ways of being and understanding the world, is really good for like my own learning and my intellectual flexibility and my understanding of the world, and my appreciation for the fact that different people have different values and different ways of being, and those are I believe that there are some things that are just like that are objective truths, but also there are things that are relativistic and are culturally situated and contextual, and being able to engage with people in that way in Korea has been a great blessing.
You have your situation is like very, very unique, and so I guess like two questions. One is, have you come across anybody else with like a very unusual kind of Korean American background like yours that is also working in the like Korean drama production space? And then like two is, you had mentioned there are I guess like advantages that are afforded to you because of your American background, but then there's also some disadvantages from a work context perspective. I was wondering if you could maybe share more on that front as well.
Yeah. Like me, I don't know, actually. I don't think so. I don't know him very well, but the person that I mentioned earlier to you today, the guy who made Drama Fever, might be, but I don't know his story well enough to really say.
Yeah.
I don't know really any Korean Americans who work in this industry. I think partly because it's not only very demanding linguistically, but it's culturally very demanding. So you have to really, there's a lot of like things that, because you're working a lot and it's a very people-oriented business and it moves very, very quickly, you have to be really finely attuned to like the sensitivities of like the way people think here and like how certain things might get, misinterpreted or how to become close with people, like becoming getting people to open up to you is like really important in, I think, creative industries. And I think that it can be very difficult when you are not super familiar with the culture and like how to present yourself or present your ideas or what will go over and what won't and what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. And yeah, to that end, I would say that to the advantages of being American, I mean, part of the advantage is just that like there is a economic and educational and informational advantage. Like this is something I was thinking about the other day, like in the age of information, even just speaking English is such a huge advantage because like so much of the internet's infrastructure is in English. I mean, AI is like mostly trained on English data models, research papers, like cutting edge research, humanities research institutions, most of them are in English speaking countries. So I was like, I'm working on a film right now and my assistant director is like really brilliant Korean guy who's like very interested in history and philosophy and humanities. But we were talking about this thing and I was like realizing that you can't actually like access information about this piece of literary history in Korean really because there aren't that many the like current discourse that's happening isn't in Korean, like it's all in English. So there's like a fundamental barrier to the kinds of like ideological discourse that's happening in like specific literary spaces because like the history of like literary studies is happening in these institutions that just so happen to be English because the history of the UK is one of imperialism and like world domination, and then from that Britain being the undeniable world power, it has become America, and then that history of like what 500-600 years actually like influences directly the amount of information that is available in different languages. And English is now sort of undeniably the language of like globalization, global capitalism, all of these things, and so there is like a inherent advantage in that, right? And that is both literal and like in terms of like information access, but also symbolic. So I have access to a level of symbolic and cultural capital that is associated with both my Americanness and my fluency in English, but also the sort of elite institutions that I attended as a result of the fact that I have grown up as a native English speaker. And, I didn't necessarily like have access to like private education or these kinds of things, but like I was good at school and I was smart and I knew that these universities existed and I was an American citizen, and so like I could go to these schools, right? And the other, I think, related benefit interpersonally is that, and this doesn't actually have that much to do with me being American specifically, but more just that people know I'm a foreigner, is that I can push the envelope a little bit, because what happens when you're very aware that someone else is from a different country, and this happened to me when I was a child as well, that like the visual, I think that there are things that structural realities of our existence that always make anyone feel like they don't belong, that have the capacity to make anyone feel like they don't belong. I mean, that's what the reality of like patriarchy and class and like all of these like structures of power are. But when you have the very clear example of like in America this happens and in Korea this happens, and when I do the exact same thing in these two environments, the reaction is different. What you realize is that it's not actually about you. There is like a structural or societal or cultural thing happening. the fact is that this is happening all the time because we exist in structures all the time that do not necessarily benefit us, and in some ways they do benefit us, and it's sometimes difficult when you're in just one place to visualize how some things might be about your behavior, but some things might be, you know, a result of specific structures. And I think it's hard sometimes to see that with a very clear critical eye. But what happens when you are offered the very obvious like visual vehicle of like, or visual or conceptual vehicle of like, this person is from a different country, then I think what happens sometimes is that it becomes easier to conceptualize that like something that they do that offends me might not actually be because their intent is to offend me, but because they have a way of being and a way of existing that is different. And so what is afforded to me, the benefit that is afforded to me by being a foreigner here is that even though I speak Korean very fluently and I look Korean, they know that I'm American. And so when I offer opinions that are sort of outside of the box, it allows me a little bit of added benefit of the doubt or intellectual flexibility on their part, where it's like the opinions that I'm offering might not just be because I'm like young and dumb, but maybe because I have a different perspective from a training that is outside of what, you know, other Korean producers might have. And I think sometimes I'm wrong because I don't have that as much experience, and sometimes I say the wrong thing, but also sometimes I have, you know, beneficial things to add to the working environment that I exist in. And the fact of being able to both understand that the position I occupy is not one of is not necessary. It's I'm an outsider, quote unquote, but I think that has kind of like a negative connotation. My ability to understand both like the ways to connect with people inside of the culture that is familiar and inside of the social rules or the social contract that is familiar, but also emphasize at times when I am outside of those things, or when my position or opinion is outside of that existing social contract. Having these two routes open to me has like sort of in some ways like maximized my ability to work, I think, effectively, and that is just like, you know, a reality specific to me and my experience. And I'm not saying that's better or worse than anyone else's strategy, but it's kind of useful, I think, and reflective of the fact that like when you work with people, and when people is the trade that your stories, narratives, people is the trade that you're working in, understanding how the different kind of the things that are, you know, outside of your control, like the culture or the privilege or the realities that you were born into, how they're being perceived, and then how you can make them understandable or make them known, and use that to make yourself better understood and make yourself better known by other people, is a skill that I would not have been able to develop had I not moved here for the first time in that first year and been like kind of bad at it, and like just been like this sort of dumb young American, and people were gracious about that. They gave me grace and they wanted to help me, and that was like a very intense training, but I do think it is hugely beneficial. And you know, there are obviously like downsides. Like the downside is that I am like not as good at Korean as I am in English, and that is like frustrating. And also like the other downside is that like I do have experiences that are very difficult to explain to people here, and that's just like a reality of like, you know, I grew up in a place outside of here that most people in Korea have never been, and like in a culture that is not like immediately, you know, if you haven't lived it, isn't immediately accessible or understandable. And so like there are often times where I feel like certain things that are fundamental to my character or my values or my being are you know, being, you know, there are things in Korean society that I really chafe against, but that is also a reality of like living in a predominantly white country. That's like a reality of living in many different places. There are always structures that we will sort of come up against and struggle against. And I found at least that while being here, especially in the relationships that I have made here, that I appreciate and value, when I explain these things or I try to make them known, the people that I respect understand, and they, you know, that's like a little change that I am hopefully able to affect in like the way that people are understanding or engaging with people in society in this day and age.
We were talking before we started recording about the latest project that you're working on.
Oh, yeah.
Are you open now to sharing a little bit about that?
I can talk about that. So yeah, I am working on a short film right now. It's based off of a short story that I wrote for this journal called Asymptote. As I mentioned, they do stuff in literary translation space here, and then they publish a little bit of original fiction every edition. If you look up Asymptote Journal Clara Park, I think you should come up, but I guess you can like link it or whatever. The story is about this girl, Korean American girl, who meets a fox on her university campus, and the fox talks to her. And so the fox is based off of this legend of the Gumiho in Korean folktales. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Gumiho, but it's a nine-tailed fox. And there are a lot of different versions of the story, but traditionally it's like the nine-tailed fox becomes this like beautiful woman who seduces men, and then the fox at night transforms into a fox and then steals the liver of the man. And then the legend is that like if the fox eats enough livers, they can like, you know, become a human again or achieve eternal life or whatever. And so there's a couple of resonances here that the story I think plays on. Is one of them is that the idea of like a succubus, seductress, evil spirit is, you know, it has these kind of like patriarchal connotations in some ways. And so there's you know, there's also a way in which like Korean women, the Han and the Hwapbyung, like these are things that are in some ways I think are reflective of the fact that like Korea's version of Neo-Confucianism is very explicitly patriarchal and misogynistic, and it has been historically very difficult for women to be beautiful or be noticeable or be obvious or shine, really, because those are things that are, you know, they say, I met with the older Korean woman the other day, a mentor of mine, and she was saying like, you know, in Korean larger companies, she would recommend against like 튀는 거, 튀지 마, which means like don't stand out. Standing out is not good for women. And then, in the story, it's like the setting is the 설정, the background is kind of that this girl has been sent to America to live from a young age because her family in Korea doesn't really want her to experience these things. They want her to be able to succeed and like shine and be very bright and all of these things. But in America, she sort of struggles with the pressure of needing to be perfect all the time, needing to set a good example, and also the feeling of like, you know, the very subtle violence of white supremacy, which is that anything that is not knowable by whiteness, by epistemology, is not true, right? And so that's kind of one of the ways I would say that white American culture expresses itself, is that there is like and there's like wiggle room inside of it, but the reality is that like the dominant culture in America is white culture, and when things really transgress against those expectations, the people inside of that culture are made to feel like they are the issue, rather than that they're the people that do not necessarily fit into those social or cultural expectations are actually just having a different way of being, a different ideology, a different, you know, reflection on life. It's that they're crazy or that they're strange, right? And so when this girl meets the fox, she hears the fox talk to her because the fox is a Gumiho, but all of the white people in her university think she's going crazy. And so there's this the story is about a girl, you know, the thematic resonance here is kind of about belonging. It's about being seen, and whether or not we have a capacity to see others and be seen by others when we are limited by these different structures, and how these structures inflict violence even when the people who are perpetuating them have the best intentions. And the other thing that I think I wanted to accomplish when I wrote this story initially was that I do think that a lot of Korean American stories have a capacity to write about Korea with a very nostalgic and a romantic lens. And I think it makes sense, right? Because it's like a lot of the times the way that we access Korea is through the memories of our parents, and memory is a fickle narrator. It's not reliable. And I actually think a lot of Korean American directors and writers, they self-reflexively write about this. So like Celine Song's like Past Lives, I think she is kind of like making a commentary actually on the fact that memory and nostalgia is not reliable, and that's why the main character might see things through a lens that, you know, didn't really actually ever exist or might not exist anymore. But I think what I kind of wanted to point out in some ways is that there are structural violences that exist in both places. And for the girl, it's the reason she feels she is really caught is because the reality is that she left Korea because there is a way in which she cannot be seen or understood in that culture or that society there. But the irony is that in America, there are also structures that prevent her from being truly seen or understood in that structure in America as well. And the real tragedy is that no one in either place can really understand this. Like when she tries to explain to her family in Korea, she doesn't really try because it's very difficult to explain what like a hegemonic culture does to you when you are outside of it. It's not super easy to articulate. And in America, she kind of just feels like there are experiences she has that are not explainable or not understandable, which makes sense because this is not accessible, right? But with the fox, it's the fox who everyone thinks is making her go crazy. The fox understands and knows everything. But the fox is a very neutral character. The fox doesn't actually say she should do one thing or she should be one way. And so I kind of wanted to write a story that was more of a reflection on this structural sense of like seeing and belonging and being seen that didn't really offer one as a solution, what one place was the solution to the other place, but rather that the thinking that there is a place that resolves these problems is probably part of the problem, that the reality is that structures of power exist wherever you are, and that is more complicated in that like there are structures of power that supersede other structures of power, and this is a separate conversation, but that is what the story is about. And then my director at my company is executive producing the film. My assistant director is a very brilliant Korean guy who won the Busan Short International. So the Busan International Film Festival runs a grant fund development for shorts, and he won that last year. And then his one of his projects is being featured in the Korean competition this year, and he's also been featured in like Bucheon and Jeonju, other film festivals in Korea. And then I have like a local producer in the US who is also very brilliant. He is, I think, directed or produced over 20 shorts, and he's done worked as an assistant director or camera operator on I think 2 feature films. So I'm excited about the sort of fundamentally international nature of the team itself. I think that these people could have a lot to learn from each other, and I'm excited to see how that plays out. And yeah, we're in the last round of funding right now to raise money for the post-production costs, because there's a lot of VFX involved with the rendering of the fox itself. But we're planning to shoot at the end of August and the beginning of September. And yeah, this is a large part of the reason I came back here also instead of working in Hollywood, is that I think that I want to learn from and work with Korean creatives, and then connect them with the people that I know in the States, and see what kind of comes out of this new era, where like more multinational, more multicultural productions that are like multicultural and multinational in infrastructure, and the nature of the infrastructure is possible. And I'm excited to see where that goes. So yeah, I'll send you the link if you want to read the story or whatever.
Yeah, that's awesome. Even one of the reasons why I've become increasingly excited about Cambridge is because there are very interesting cross-cultural collaborations that I think are not happening already, where I'll meet like a handful of people in Korea that haven't spent that much time outside of Korea, but they speak English well, and there's a bunch of people in the States that I know would find their work very interesting. And I feel like having some sort of infrastructure to allow that mind melding to happen is like can be a valuable thing. So it's cool to even see like through your work some of the stuff that's going on. we're gonna have to wrap up.
Yeah, totally.
But thank you for, I know you were sort of tentative. We talked earlier, like in the conversation, just about podcasting and what role it plays in today's society. But I'm very grateful that you were willing to entertain the conversation. So thank you.
I mean, that's like I said, I don't have a normative take specifically on the individual, but I think it's interesting to think about the media landscape as itself. It's an ecosystem, and like kind of ecosystem that it both like might change certain logics, but also reinforces existing logic of the way that we engage with information sharing in the digital capitalist era that we live in. So that was all kind of the idea that I was getting at. But yeah, I'm happy to do a part 2 because it does feel like you have more questions.
Yes. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll wrap up now, but to be continued. So we're back again.
Yeah, part 2.
Usually with the podcast, it's if I give myself an hour and a half, I feel like I cover most ground. But we recorded like almost for an hour and a half yesterday, and then there were still a number of things that I wanted to ask you about, and then I know there were things that you wanted to expand on and share as well. One of the points I wanted to ask you about, and I knew you had some thoughts around, was just from a language learning perspective. You have become incredibly proficient in learning Korean language. So I've just been curious about your learning acquisition with Korean and how you've become so fluent, and what that experience has been like for you.
I think I mentioned you to this yesterday. The way I tend to think about it in terms of language is that I think communication and language ability are two sort of separate skills. And communication, I think, has a lot to do with how much you understand the other person, how much you understand yourself, and the relationship that you have to that other person, depending on the position that you two are occupying. And so that depends on a lot of things. In Korea, the most prominent factor is probably, I have a certain cultural background. This person has a certain cultural background. So there are certain concepts, references, cultural realities that are easier to access for the person that I'm speaking to. And then for me, language is kind of the vehicle to make those references, make understanding possible between these two positions, capable, like possible. And in English, I would say that my vehicle, so the language, the vocabulary, my capacity to use rhetorical devices is pretty much on par with my communication level. And so, and that's just because I have more data, like on English speakers, on the English language, all of these different things. In Korean, I would say my language vehicle is a lot less proficient. It's less expansive. And so when I'm communicating with Korean speakers, a lot of the time how I could phrase it yesterday was that my communication ability is sort of compensating for my relatively or comparatively smaller vehicle capacity. And so if I'm wanting to explain a very difficult concept, I'm sort of thinking through first in my head, like, what is the concept generally speaking? What is the easiest or most accessible reference for that concept that I know, maybe with like a 95% accuracy, the other person will immediately be able to understand. And so what I mean by that is like, maybe it's a cultural reference, or it's a turn of phrase, or an idiom that exists already in the Korean language. And then based on, what I have identified as the most effective way to communicate what I'm trying to communicate as a concept, I sort of attach then my language ability, which is the vehicle, put that concept in the vehicle, and then I sort of, you're driving it out. It's like you're sending an envoy to try and see if you can be understood by the other person. And this doesn't always work, obviously. But the reason I bring this up is because you had sort of asked me like, oh, is there like do you have to do like a buffering where you're like translating in your head and then you're speaking? I would say for me, because I in the first place don't really have an internal monologue, there isn't really a translation process that's happening, because either way it's sort of thought to language rather than like thought to language to different language and then articulation. But the sort of caveat there is that then in Korean, because I have a strong idea of like how capacious my vehicle is of the language itself. What the calculation that I'm making in my head is like, what is it that I already know how to communicate with my vehicle with the language capacity that I have, and then how is it that concept best fits to that vehicle. And I think that this is like not this doesn't really fully answer your question, but it I think gives a sense of like you were saying yesterday, like you realize that people really engage with language very differently. People think very differently. That's kind of my process. And so I would say like maybe in the early days of my acquisition, it was there was maybe a little bit more of like in-head translation, but because so much of my language acquisition here when I first started learning was through dramas and conversation rather than study, what ended up happening is that I just like wouldn't really think about things in Korean that I didn't know how to express. So like the way that I learned Korean is very just in the existing realm of like how in the Korean language you express certain things, what phrases are commonly used, what idioms are commonly used. And obviously at the beginning, this was very, very limited. So I would just, in my interactions with people, I would kind of do my best to like fit the language ability to like what I wanted to express or how I wanted to be interacting with someone else. And then that would be supplemented by a lot of like body language or, doing activities or that kind of thing. And then as I've gotten better at Korean, it's sort of, I've been able to upgrade into the realm of like, I'm giving arguments or opinions about scripts or storytelling or narrative structures. And that at times is frustrating. Like there are moments where I'm like, oh, I know this concept in English. I don't know what the word is exactly. So then I'll have to like explain the whole like context of the concept that I'm trying to explain. But to answer the second part of or maybe this was the first part of your question actually, on if I think that there are sort of like age benchmarks that you have to hit in order to be fully proficient or fully fluent. Like I imagine that yes, like I don't think I'll ever be as comfortable in Korean as I am in English. But at the same time, I also do think that my experience with it has been a lot of like, I don't really, set benchmarks. I'm not like, oh, I need to like be this amount of good.
Yes.
For me, it's has been very much about like, I want to be understood, and there's like a level of the other person needing to understand me for me to like be fulfilled and be working proficiently and be competent in this industry.
Yes.
And I have been able to get to that point now. I don't know really, like, it's very hard for me to say like when that actually like shifted. So a lot of it even was, I think there were probably a lot of times where like I entered a situation where I wasn't quite yet there where I needed to be, and then it took a couple of months of adjusting, and then eventually I start to find my footing again, and my vocabulary expands, and there are new ways that my brain starts to work. But then again, I guess this goes back to my other thing about like how I don't really think in a language necessarily, because you asked like, oh, do you think in English or do you think in Korean? Like when I'm working Korean, I'm just thinking, and then I speak in Korean, and then when I'm working in English, I'm just also thinking, and I speak in English.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's like maybe it's unusual, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I find originally when I started Cambridge, I had thought it would mostly be for people like myself, where it's like second, third, fourth generation Korean diaspora that were living in Seoul or that were abroad and looking to get connected to other Korean diaspora profiles. And what's been very interesting and surprising to me is how the kind of technological developments over the past like few decades have shaped certain identities to exist, specifically where there are Korean people that I've met. They started consuming English-speaking content very early on in their childhood, and because so much of the informational input that they've received, even though they've never been outside of Korea before, they feel like almost more American or more Western in some of their beliefs and how they express themselves. And so then they go to like they start working for a more Korean company, and they feel kind of frustrated because there's a part of their individual experience that isn't as well received in those sorts of environments. And so they have come with interest in Cambridge. And that isn't something that I could have ever predicted. But I realized that even amongst Korean people, Korean citizens, let's say, the individual experiences are quite radically different as well.
Yeah, and so I guess, to that point, I think it just speaks to the fact that like the idea of identity is something fundamental or fixed, and identity and individual belonging or integration is something fundamental and fixed, I think is not a reality necessarily. I guess I think the point that I'm trying to make, and there are realistic and structural limitations to what we are able to do and how we are able to maximize our capacity to be known and understood in what is in reality like everyone has a very individual experience of the world and of life, but I don't necessarily know that like diaspora, because we are a diaspora, we don't have a capacity to belong in this place or in this place, that necessarily being an experience that is limited to diaspora. And I don't necessarily think that us having grown up outside of Korea necessarily means that we won't be able to be understood and known by Korean people or fit into Korean society. There are things that we may chafe against, but the reality is also that like many Korean people also chafe against that. That's just, I think, a reality of living in a society and living in structures that are very dominant and hegemonic, and you really shape the trajectory of our lives. And to that end, I would say I think your point about American individualism is true, and individualism, and also in some ways the lie of American exceptionalism, is something that is very fundamental to American culture and the trajectory of American history. And this is not, again, I don't really have I don't want to take a strong normative take on this, pro or against, but I do think that there are certain socio-political and geopolitical realities that make the American individualist mindset not delusional, or it has existed in a way that people have not really outright called it delusional. And the reason is because America and Silicon Valley, controls an incredible amount of power and money in the world. And so as an American, if you're growing up and you are told that you are going to change the world, and then you do all the right things, and this is also, there's like a lie of meritocracy in here. A lot of the things are environmental. So it's like you have to be lucky, and there's a lot of different things in there. But you really could, because you could become a tech billionaire, and then you could do whatever you wanted, and that would actually change the trajectory of like the geopolitical reality of the world. I think that system in a lot of ways is broken and is like predicated fundamentally on a very uneven structure of global capitalism. But the reality of like Korea, for example, is that in Korea you can be told this, but like even as I was saying, I don't know if I mentioned this yesterday, but like I was saying yesterday, like even just in the fact that like the vast majority of the internet is in English, like you're already in some ways limited by the sociopolitical, sociolinguistic, geopolitical realities of like being in this society. And I'm not saying that it's like impossible to break through that ceiling, but I do think that there is a way in which, it is more, it has always been the political strategy and economic strategy of Korea to make alliances, to choose battles very wisely, to think about how they exist relationally in a geopolitical sense. And that's not really something that you think about as an American person. Like if you become the president of America, you like can control the outcomes of the entire world. If you become the president of Korea, realistically speaking, the power that you wield is much, much more relational. It's about who you are choosing to ally yourself with. It is about how the Korean people see you and what you're doing in terms of, increasing, cultural or soft power. Like these are the things that, the Korean geopolitical reality is adjusted to. And that has an influence on culture and individual attitudes. And I guess this also goes back to what I'm saying about study, is that a lot of these things are reference points or cultural attitudes or individual attitudes that are actually become much more understandable when you are able to take a wider lens and think about the ways that you and I are conditioned because of the geopolitical, ideological, and cultural realities that we grew up in, rather than things that are necessarily inherent to us as individuals. And there are going to be things that are inherent to us as individuals, because all of the structures that you and I interact with are necessarily going to be different from person to person. But part of the project of understanding people and culture and movements is also trying to understand how the ways that we grow up and the things that we are told are necessarily reflective or inflective of the realities that we live in, and those realities change very drastically depending on where you grow up, what language you are adjusted to. And
it's funny, and it's also very cool to even think about how things that inform an individual's identity and character, like where they're at in terms of when they were born in relation to their other siblings, right? Like the oldest versus the youngest in a large family, right? Is like they're dealt very different cards in terms of their responsibilities as a family, and that ends up shaping a lot of their identity and character. But then to look at also like the national level of, like you were saying, Korea has very different cards and different interests that it would play to, and America has very different cards and different interests that it would play to, and those things kind of influence the types of like cultures that are born within those types of societies as well. I found that quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good segue to my study of the Korean cultural production field. So this is what I focused on during my time at Oxford, and it obviously relates very heavily to what I do for my work. But I was sort of like have been like very fundamentally interested in this phenomenon of the Korean cultural, the Hallyu wave, the increased interest in Korea. And like, I can give like, I don't know, the brief history of the field is like, you have the earliest Korean entertainers, performers are like the Kim sisters from the 1950s. They're like Korean women who learn American songs and then make sort of do Korean riffs on them and perform for American soldiers at military bases. And then in the 1960s, you have, the golden age of Korean film, where they're taking a lot of influence from Japanese and American film and thinking a lot about the rise in consumerism and the introduction of industrialism and capitalism in Korean society. And then, in the 70s and 80s, you have this sort of very strict authoritarian regime. So there's not a lot of cultural movement, cultural production happening in this time. And then, and this is also why, like, at that time, singers were very much at the whim of the broadcasting stations. The broadcasting stations, traditionally the three, NBC, KBS, SBS, are all sort of government funded, and those are, like, at the time especially, very heavily censored. And then in the 1990s, you have this. This is like 1990s is when Korea first democratically elects its first president. And you have I think the second democratically elected president. Don't quote me on that. That might be wrong. His name is Kim Dae-jung. He's called the cultural president, and he sort of kickstarts a wave of all these, like, government-led initiatives in developing the Korean cultural sector. And this is also around the time that sort of K-pop sensation Seo and Boys comes up for the first time. And Seo and Boys is, they're considered like the modern, the founding fathers of Korean pop, the Korean pop system. And what they did is basically they sort of pioneered this hybrid style of, like, taking from hip hop, R&B, Euro pop, and mixing it together and having this Korean twist on it. And then they become so popular that the power, the soft power, the cultural capital that they maintain is more than the broadcasting station. So then they start to get to choose who they're going to perform with. This is the modern birth of the Korean pop industry. And so from that group, I think Isuman and YG were both in that group, and so they both found their own production studios, SM and YG, obviously, and they found the K-pop trainee system. So they're gonna take these Korean talent and they're gonna hybridize, different trends from around the world in pop and train these kids in that tradition, and then they're gonna debut them, and they release hit after hit after hit, obviously. And that's like how we have the modern pop system, where you have the trainee system. And what's really interesting about that is what's necessarily Korean about this is not the art necessarily. I mean, there are artistic aspects of it that are very influenced by these Korean people, but what becomes very distinctly Korean is actually the infrastructure. And so the infrastructure of creating this system and then identifying what the global trends are and then training Korean people in it, and then marketing them to Japan, China, Southeast Asia, and then now, like, recently with the rise of Blackpink and BTS in the 2010s, even like the West, Latin America, all these places. Now even with HYBE, you have this very interesting experiment of Cat's Eye, which is a global K-pop group. And people say they're not K-pop, like, they're not Korean. Yeah, they're not Korean. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're K-pop, but, like, what is K-pop, right? Like, K-pop in a lot of ways is the infrastructure that's created by these companies, where you have these you stick a producer with a group that is debuting, and then they exist in this trainee system. You sometimes do, like, a survival show to put the girls together, put the people together, and then you're drawing on local and global talent to actually produce the music and the dance, and then you are packaging it and then selling it to global audiences. That infrastructure, that system fundamentally is very Korean. Like, that's not, and that we can argue about, like, whether they pioneered this or if this is necessarily unique. But I think the point that I'm making here is that when we think about what Koreanness is in the entertainment industry, the K of it is oftentimes this infrastructure, and the K of it, the infrastructure, is very finely attuned to the reality that Korean people have to appeal to markets outside of Korea, because Korea is not large enough to sustain a very large entertainment industry. And so this is going back to the reality of, what are the sociopolitical or geopolitical realities that are influencing cultural attitudes or cultural strategies. What is happening in Korea is that Korea, for all of its 2,000-year history, has always been very sensitive to the intellectual, social movements, in literary movements that are coming in from outside, and that for a long time that was China, for example. But since the 1950s, when South Korea as a state was developed, hybridity has been a very fundamental part of the entertainment industry in Korea. And so that was because the geopolitical reality at the time was that Korean people were not paying for entertainment, but American soldiers were. And so the Kim sisters are born. Seo and Boys is taking from global culture, because Korean culture is not hegemonically global culture. They're taking influence from global culture and then creating the infrastructure to produce that in Korea. And then, eventually this like system of like, we take Japanese and Chinese trainees to appeal to the Japanese and Chinese markets. We take Southeast Asian trainees to appeal to the Southeast Asian markets. These are all things that are very natural and embedded into the Korean cultural production infrastructure in a way that is not really the same in other countries. The US, for example, the US tends not to take, the US entertainment sector and culture is very diverse, but fundamentally much of it's because America is diverse, right? Like these people are mostly American. They speak English. They are being marketed to American audiences. The target audience, the creator and the target audience is very stable. So you have like a pretty stable relationship between like you create a product, which is the artist or the song or the show, and you're marketing it to an American audience. And then because American culture is global, hegemonically global, oftentimes it goes beyond that and people around the world watch it. But fundamentally that's very stable. But in Korea, it's like in the drama industry, for example, initially it was based off of the Japanese model, and then when China was buying a lot of remakes, then Korean drama producers would very intentionally produce rom-coms that they knew would do well in China, variety TV formats that do well in China. And then there's the Hayeongae, which is there was a ban on the Chinese companies purchasing Korean entertainment content for the past 8 years. When that happened, Korea started to shift over to the OTT era. And so now we have miniseries formats that are very, very different from what you would see even just like 6 years ago. A lot more explicit violence because, there are still like some censorship requirements for the channels that you can't make content that shows stuff, the kind of stuff that you see on Disney Plus or Apple or Netflix, but content that is more scenario focused rather than character or romance focused, and content that focuses on very global themes like capitalism or the patriarchy. These are things that are more easily accessible to global audiences. So like something like Squid Game is a very Korean story, but the struggle of the working class against elite class that is exploiting the working class for entertainment is a very universally understandable theme. And then that sort of does well on Netflix and then becomes a global sensation. And so I guess this is like a sort of long tangent that I've gone into now, but the two takeaways that I would say from this is that the first of all is when we think about what is it about Korean culture that has created this sort of what is now a pretty long lasting interest, if you include the sort of like early 2000s 2010s where Korean culture was already doing really well in Asia and Southeast Asia. The thing that is Korean infrastructure is very good at is the flexibility and hybridity, I would say. And that has a lot to do with the geopolitical and sociopolitical realities of Korean history. As we were saying before, like a lot of our attitudes and cultural attitudes are sort of framed by those things. And the second takeaway that I would say is that the K in K-pop or K-drama is it will change. It's not stable. And so, there's people are often like these days, they're like, what is K? What is Koreanness? And I think the point here is that the society and the infrastructure and the people and the attitudes exist, but this infrastructure is very flexible because it needs to be in order to survive. And so the way that K-pop is produced, like Cat's Eye, like global audience, like global groups, like the shift in BTS from making Korean music to English music, which I like personally think that their Korean music is much better, but like those kinds of shifts, right, are not things that you can stop by being like, that's not Korean. Now they're just pop, right? But whatever was necessarily, how do you define the line between like this thing is Korean and this thing isn't Korean? And you can make very detailed and critical and nuanced analyses of like, this is how the Korean identity and like cultural ideals have been infused with global products or other cultural influences. You can make those like high level analyses of different from different eras of different Korean works, but you cannot, like, there is no way to define like this part was Korean and then this part was Korean, and then we've lost this part, and then now we only have this part. That
Right.
I think it's not a very productive or even just like a realistic understanding of like what cultural history is and how ideas and concepts move and flow through time. And
It does seem quite incredible, though, that in a country with a population of 50 million, I mean, there are many other countries that have population sizes in relatively same kind of size range, right? And many of them have access to the internet and are quite developed. And yet somehow across so many industry sectors, right, like K-beauty, K-pop, K-drama, this Korean infrastructure has found a way to continuously like tap into the global market. I guess, like, in part, do you attribute that to, we talked about like cultural understanding of like Korean diaspora trying to live in Korea and how important and valuable it is to get access to the language, because then you can build like a real understanding of the people that live here by having conversation, like maybe deep conversations with them, right? At the top of these like K-pop, K-drama organizations, the people who are kind of running the show, making these strategic decisions, there must also be like a very deep cultural, cross-cultural understanding of like the global market as well. I mean, that has to do with something about how the performance of like K media has performed over the past decade or so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a large enough sample size to like definitively make an argument about this, but I would say that it's probably not necessarily as intentional as you might think it might be. The reality, I think, is more that you know, I don't know what other countries of our size that you may be referencing, but the reality is more that my personal opinion would be that after the establishment of the Korean state, Korea is kind of like inundated with all these like products from outside. So music, film, cosmetic items, those are all coming in from outside because Korea was not really producing anything at this time. And so and the other situation is that Korea is not a small country in terms of like compared to like European countries, for example, not like super small, but like compared to China and Japan, very small, right? And so, and not a lot of natural resources, not a very good like militarily very strategic position in this like Asian peninsula. Kind of actually amazing that like Korea managed to be independent, like for all of like that Korea is like an independent nation after all this time. Like usually you would see it get swallowed up by like perhaps a larger country in the region. Like China is so much larger than Korea, for example. And what that I think produces is a sort of inherent or a very just like, you know, it's like almost instinctive sensitivity to what is going on outside of your own country. And so when Korean people are consuming from early on, like when they're consuming films and media, the language of film, media, and entertainment that they are consuming is, yes, influenced by certain Korean traditions like pansori or trot. Well, trot is actually in and of itself very hybrid. I don't know if you know the trot genre music. Trot is a genre of music that is a blend of traditional Korean music style and Japanese city pop that first existed, I think, don't quote me on this, maybe in the imperial era, and then became like repopularized in the 60s or 70s, but now is like a relatively popular like nostalgic genre for Korean listeners. But like the thing about that also is that like it's always been that you have Korean, you know, ideas and stories and traditions, but then they're mixing very freely with no kind of sense of like purism. Like there isn't really in Korea like you have to do this way because otherwise like our Koreanness will be lost. That isn't really happening. And so in the golden age of cinema in Korea in the 60s, you have these films that are like very obviously based off of like classic Hollywood age films from the 20s and 30s, like silent black and white films. And then that film language is then being translated into the work of filmmakers like Bong Joon-ho and Park Chan-wook. And they're also taking from like the Japanese golden age of film because they're very influenced by Japanese filmmakers when those movies would come in from Korea because Korean people wanted to watch those films. So what's happening is that the actual language of entertainment is inherently already very global. And so that's not something that you are necessarily learning in a class in the case of these producers or these directors, but it is something that you are constantly surrounded with. It's a language of storytelling that has, what are the things that work across cultural borders? Those are the things that do well in Korea, that come in from outside. Those are the things that these filmmakers are being trained on. And then those are the things that they are riffing off of from their own experiences to create something that is at once very Korean and also very global. And I think what has happened is that Korea has now we have hit a point in history where these kinds of products are very, very marketable, because globalization and the digital era has made it very possible for people all over the world to watch these kinds of things. And everyone in the world is familiar with the language of Hollywood. So when you watch a movie, you're actually pretty much expecting, to some extent, the storytelling format that was like codified by the Hollywood like 3-act screenplay, for example. And that's like, taken from, like, in some ways, like Aristotle's Poetics. Like there's like a long literary history of like how these kinds of things came to be. But then Korean creatives have watched all these things from a very young age. Like they watch Star Wars, they watch Star Trek, they watch Golden Age cinema, all these things, and then they take these ideas and they make something new that is born of their own individual experiences. And what the additional thing that has happened is that now, because of modernization and globalization and global capitalism, though the experiences of Korea and of America are very different in some ways they're very the same. Like we have to all go to work to make money and then pay for our families. Like that's not necessarily like the way that things were through all of history. Like for a lot of history, countries had very different relationships to like what the day-to-day reality of life was. But these days, Korean people a lot of people in Southeast Asia or South Asia can relate to Korean stories about modernization, for example, because it's a very similar story of like isolationism, and then some kind of imperial or colonial power, and then transition from indigenous or traditional history to neoliberalism and globalization, or like the IMF crisis is something that happened like across all of Asia. And so like when Korean people make films and stories about the IMF crisis, this is something that like is actually relatable across different cultural experiences, even though you're drawing from like very different, obviously, like languages, and the day-to-day reality of these people are very different. And so there's like kind of this perfect storm of like Korea has a very specific history of being very sensitive to the cultural languages of the outside, because they are, as we say in Korean, like 고래싸움에 낀 새우, which means a shrimp caught between whales. And that's relative, right? So like 50 million is pretty big, but like compared to like 1 billion is not very big, right?
Yes.
And then in Europe you don't have 1 billion, so it's like everyone is kind of like a whale in their own right. Although like mid-sized countries in Europe are like they're whales, they fight with each other. And then you also have, the leadership or the foresight of a few leaders in the 1990s, or a very concerted effort to like develop the cultural sector in Korea. This is also like there's other things to do with that shift in the 1990s. Like part of the problem was that like South Korea doesn't really have any oil reserves or natural resources or anything like that. And so what they were realizing in the 1990s is that Korea would need to make a very concerted pivot towards intellectual technologies. So information technology, semiconductors, literal like digital technology, and then like the cultural sector in order to make money, because you cannot really like produce things, like literal things in Korea at like a high enough volume to actually sustain the growth of the economy.
Yes.
So there's like that also happening, where these like people are very heavily investing in the entertainment sector, like private public VC funds. These days, like dramas receive millions of dollars from the government every year to get produced. There's all these like government initiatives that doesn't really exist in America, really. Like the extent of government involvement in the entertainment sector is like tax cuts. And then finally you have like this digital era, this globalized era, where the experiences of one the very local experiences of one country have suddenly become legible to a lot of other countries. And that is also a reality that like has become the case because of like the internet and the fact that we are all like connected but also kind of not connected. And this is one of the themes of like Okja, for example, if you've seen that film by Bong Joon-ho. It's about this like giant sort of like genetically modified super pig that this agricultural conglomerate is, you know, making, and they like raise one in Korea. And kind of one of the themes of the film is that like realistically speaking, the experiences of like a Korean farmer in the mountains in Korea is very different from the CEO of this conglomerate in New York City, but they're connected by the consumption infrastructure of things like agriculture or capitalism or consumerism in a way that has not been true for most of history. But we now like ship our livestock and our agriculture from all over the world, and you know, people are all implicated in this infrastructure of consumption, whether or not they actually, you know, whether or not their day-to-day lives have any resemblance to each other. And that being true is something that has a very real impact on the lives of people all over the world, and I think is something that makes today's Korean products very legible across the world. And that's why stuff like Parasite or Squid Game, for example, does really well. They take a very local story that is thinking about global structures like capitalism, imperialism, neo-imperialism, cultural imperialism, and putting them in a Korean story, because this is what these filmmakers know really well and can draw really, you know, illustrate for us really beautifully. But like Bong Joon-ho said, like I think he gave an interview where he was like, you know, the reason that this film does well is because we all live in the same country now, and that country is capitalism. We all live in the same sort of, for the most part, we have the same cards in that regard. We have to play the same cards in order to survive. And yeah, I don't want to like take a political stance on this, but I think that it is a reality that global capitalism is one of the more hegemonic structural realities of the way that modern life is organized. And that is something that, you know, a lot of Korean entertainment, you know, providers have been able to identify really acutely, because they're very aware of the demands both internally on themselves, but also like the demands of satisfying the wealthier countries. So like in Squid Game, for example, you see this one scene where the people who are watching the games are actually mostly not Korean, they're Chinese, and I think there's like a Russian and a British person. This is like a slightly like on the nose, maybe a clumsy example of like how today's structure of capitalism is like a kind of neo-imperial structure where like you both contend with the competition, neoliberal competition within the country you live in, but then there's also the additional, like as we were talking about before, geopolitical reality of like how your country relates to other countries in terms of the economic structure. But these are all things that I think Korean people have been very acutely aware of for a long time, in part because the timeline of modernization is so short. So like in one person's lifetime, they see like all of this happen, and then, you know, you get even if you're not really actively, you know, articulating and studying these things, you just these very intelligent and very astute and well educated filmmakers notice these things and are able to comment on them very smartly and very subtly.
Well, I mean, just to the point of Korea and its global reach now, like one of the very interesting things is I didn't know anything about like Asian countries and their respective diasporas, right? But because I started Cambridge, like I had wondered, is there something like Cambridge that already exists? And I started doing some research. I couldn't find anything like I was envisioning, but then I came across this other community, overseas Vietnamese, basically same concept, where you had this guy, he decided to start a diaspora community for people of Vietnamese heritage, and his community is the only other diaspora community that I had found. And, you know, maybe it's just by coincidence, but the fact that you have the North and South divide for Korea, same thing with Vietnam, a lot of like geopolitical tumultuous history as well, which created a very diverse kind of diaspora population. I mean, even one of the things for Korean diaspora is maybe if you put like North Korea to the side, because that's a whole other category, if you just look at the relative population between the diaspora population and like South Korea, it's like 15% of the total population is like diasporic, right? If you include Korean diaspora as part of them. Whereas if you look at any other Asian kind of diaspora community, like Japan or Vietnam, or India, it's like 7-8%, right? And I obviously, because of Korea's like unique history and a lot of the geopolitical kind of turmoil that it's gone through, it has created a very interesting like diaspora population as well. And even with some of the K-Bridge events that I hold, like it's very interesting to note that almost every time I hold a new K-Bridge event, it's like a 50% turnover in the types of people that show up. And that's mostly because people are here for like 2 or 3 weeks and then they go home. They're here to see family. They're here for some like exchange program. And it seems like, you know, I'd love to see statistics on like the diaspora populations and how often they come back to their homeland and then go back to their respective countries, because that would be a very interesting benchmark for how much like idea turnover is happening within a specific country. And I would imagine that Korea's, because of its diaspora population, is quite high. Obviously, you can't do anything causal in terms of explaining like the K wave through its diaspora population and things like that. But I do find it quite fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know. If I'm understanding the kind of thrust of what you're saying right now, I don't know that it's a good... these two things, my instinct is that they're kind of pretty separate, would be my initial instinct. I think that... actually, maybe it's more that there's a similar root cause, but I don't think that there's a connection between the two product outcomes, if that makes sense. So the similar root cause would be that Korea has a very compressed timeline of modernity, and that is something that is, I would say, the degree to which it is compressed is pretty unique. It's like Korea was called the Hermit Kingdom until the late 1800s, and then was sort of like colonized by Japan, which is when it was first introduced to like certain industrialist movements. And then in the 1950s, it was like one of the poorest countries in the world. And, you know, I think for a few years, it was receiving the most foreign aid from the US, like by a very wide margin. And then, you know, in the 1960s and 70s, we have this very intense industrial period that is sort of augmented or fomented by a very, very intense authoritarian regime. And then you have like the democratization movement of the 80s and the 90s. And then, you know, in this just like 60 years of history, you're like cycling through really like entire like generations of like, you know, economic change and ideological change. And it's because of those things that so many people in Korea moved abroad. But it's also because of those things that so many Korean filmmakers, I think, have a very astute eye and understanding for how history and structures of political and economic reality change the way that people exist in the world. So it's less, I think maybe based on what you're saying, I think it seems more like you're drawing a correlative, like the correlation seems to come from this original, like shared origin perhaps. And like, for example, like even like you have like German and Saudi Arabian Korean diasporas because of this industrial movement where Koreans were often sent as migrant workers abroad, and then also Korean people who wanted to develop construction companies would go to these places to learn how to develop those things and then come back and develop the Korean industries. And that's, you know, the German story is more well known because of things like 국제시장, and I think there were comparatively more Koreans who ended up in Germany, but there were Koreans in Saudi Arabia as well who in the 70s and 80s were also working there in their oil and industrial sectors, and then they would come back and sort of apply what they had learned to the Korean economies. And there are, obviously we have Japanese Koreans and there are Chinese Koreans, and because of the very long and uncertain and tumultuous nature of the splitting of the peninsula, you have Koreans in Central Asia and who fled to the Soviet Union, what was at the Soviet Union at the time, and then after the Soviet Union collapsed, just become, you know, Central Asians. And it is interesting to think about also that now that Korea has become relatively economically and politically stable, how that will play out in terms of you know, people like you and me coming back. Or I don't think that it's happened in a critical mass enough yet to really make observations about how it will impact society. But you are even seeing, like, I think that recently there was a initiative by a local government in a city somewhere in the countryside. I want to say Daecheon, but I might be misremembering. in order that was offering this like free, basically like, you know, extended work visa to Korean descendants of Koreans who are living in Central Asia and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan who fled there during the Soviet Union. And then now, because the Korean birth rate is so low, they have a lack of people who are able to work, especially in these countryside areas. So they just, you know, have invited all these people back, and quite a few came back as well. And they have these like really interesting like hybrid like nursery programs for like kids who don't speak Korean quite yet, but they need to learn Korean. And a lot of these families are now like mixed race because it's been like generations. And so there are these some interesting changes that are happening now in Korean society that are also influenced by the dropping birth rates and like the fact that the economy is sort of like stagnating and these kinds of things.
Especially as it relates to like K-drama industry. And it's, I guess, like progression or evolution over the past like decade. I think the first time that we had a conversation, you kind of explained to me a little bit of the structure and how it works. And originally I thought that maybe there were these like a handful of big production companies kind of doing everything by themselves, and it's being very top down. But I think if I remember correctly, it's a much more dynamic process than that. You've been working on like a number of projects within the K-drama industry. I think it would be interesting just to hear like what your perspective of working in the industry is and how it works.
Yeah, so people can correct me on this, although I don't really know that this is an English language podcast, so I don't really know. I will give my understanding of the situation as best I can. So I am part of the generation that tends to work at these what are called independent production studios, so 독립 제작사. And the way that things used to work was around these broadcasting channels. So you guys probably are familiar with KBS, SBS, NBC. So these are like, you know, we have similar in the US, like we have ABC, NBC. They have like channels that those are distributors, channel distributors, right? And so the way that, you know, the drama entertainment industry used to work here was that, you know, these broadcasting studios, they collect money from taxes and from the government. They're like mostly government funded. And then they, you know, have in-house directors, producers, writers, all these things, right? So the way that it used to work was that you would take a test, very difficult test to get in. And this is also, it's funny because that infrastructure is very reminiscent of like the bar system of the scholars of the Yangban era and the Joseon dynasty. So that's like a very, very like Korean way of like, you know, setting up an infrastructure, an institution, an organization is like you have people take a test and then they like become, every year there's like benchmarks that they hit and then they sort of like progress forward. But so for example, you would like take a test, go to KBS, and then you would like become a producer. And, you know, as you know, in KBS, they'll have like, you know, so this number of things that they're working on. And then you would like, as a first year producer, get staffed on like a project through like a mentor who's a bit higher up than you. And then, you know, a lot of times people would start off in like, you know, sports broadcasting or variety or documentary. And then they get up little years and then they want to switch over into drama, for example. That also happens. And you'll have these producers, they'll work on things and then they'll move into directing, for example, after like a few years. So this was up until like maybe 15 years ago, this is like the dominant way that you get like a lot of these rom-coms, that kind of thing. The way it worked now is the channels have lost a lot of power because they cannot financially compete with the OTTs. And what has happened with globalization is that, you know, independent production studios and conglomerates can make a lot more money by making their own deals with distributors abroad. And so initially, like it was like KBS and NBC and SBS would take all of the rights for the Asia region or whatever, and then they would decide what to do with that. These days, like KBS and like KBS and NBC and SBS, they'll like make the deal will depend on the project. So like you'll have, for example, an independent studio produces something and then it's like a joint deal with like Netflix, KBS. So like they'll sell the broadcasting rights abroad to Netflix and the domestic broadcasting rights to KBS, and that's how they get the production budget, and then that's what they use to film the show. But because the options have diversified over the past 10 years in terms of like who you can sell to, there's like, you know, buyers in Southeast Asia now. Like I think Viki is a Southeast Asian company, for example, and like Viki buys a lot of stuff now, and Vicky broadcast like Lovely Runner this last year, and that did super well both globally and domestically. Then obviously Netflix is like a huge player in the Korean industry now. Netflix's like regional office is so well established. It's like basically a Korean company. Like it runs very, very seamlessly with Korean production studios. This is less the case with like other global OTTs who like have less Korean employees and tend to have translators or interpreters working as like the connective link between the Korean side and the global side. But you'll have these independent production studios that are usually founded by industry veterans. So they'll usually be like a director, a producer, one of the two that has been working in the field for like 10, 15 years, and they know all the people that you need to know, and then they want to make their own stuff. So they'll found their own studio, and then they'll buy IP and develop it, and then using their connections, infrastructure, they'll pitch it to either a larger production studio like Monster Union or Studio Dragon. Studio Dragon is the production studio affiliated with CJ. CJ is not a distributor, but is like a huge conglomerate, for example. So they have more they have more resources. Yep. You'll either pitch it straight to a distributor. If it gets picked up, you might go in on it like jointly with another production studio who has more like liquid funds. So then it's like jointly produced by two production studios. Or you'll like go first to a company like Studio Dragon, be like, we're working on this thing. We want you to like help us pitch it because you have more infrastructure than we do, and then we'll be like joint producers on the project, and you'll have input on like the development of the project. Sometimes it goes the other way around, where it's like bigger studios have something that they're working on, and then they don't have the right like director or creative or producer to work on the project. So then they bring the IP to a smaller studio and say like, can you devote some manpower to this part of the production process? You'll be a joint producer, and then you'll get a cut of whatever the production budget is to like handle that in-house. So this is the way that most dramas are produced now these days, I would say. And then like, after the fact, there's all kinds of deals that happen now. It's like you sell to Netflix for these rights, or Disney Plus to an embassy for these rights, or there are like domestic streamers that you sell the domestic streaming rights to, and then you sell the overseas streaming rights abroad. Or maybe you sell like a relicensing, a remake like license to China or Japan. Like those things happen as well. And then those deals are like the ways that production studios are making money, because otherwise you just have the budget and then there's like basically nothing left over. So what's interesting though is that, and I don't know necessarily, I can't really definitively say why this is the case, but what happens is like there are like dozens and dozens of production studios, and they're all like 5 people, and they're just like these individual Koreans who like wanted to make their own studio and do what they wanted to do. And so the landscape is a lot like a startup. Like all of these companies are like startups, and you could even compare like the way that they raise funds to like the way startups raise funds. So you get like an initial round from a channel, and then you take that offer and you go to a overseas studio and you say, well, we have this much, and can you give us this much? Or you are getting investment from like China or Japan to be like, we're gonna make this, and then we'll give you the IP the license to the IP afterwards. Like, can you invest in this thing? This is good for you guys too. Or you're like, you're getting funding from the government, and you like, we're all year round, we're like applying to these government grants that give this amount of money or connect you with this platform to like get your project produced. And it's very the avenues are very diverse, and I think the avenues having become so diverse is part of the reason why the system of like these big broadcasting studios centralizing everything became less popular, because all these creatives kind of realized that if they worked really hard, they could probably maximize their ability to do what they wanted a little bit better across like what all the options are globally now. And there are a lot of cases where it doesn't work out, but it is really there is this kind of flexibility that exists in the infrastructure and a desire to try new things that I think is again goes back to this like geopolitical reality of like the industry is very finely attuned to what is going on, what the sources of funding are, and what the avenues of possibility are, because these days you can't really make a Korean drama just from like the budget of a domestic studio anymore. So like a lot of the time you're selling abroad. If you can, you're selling abroad. The channels will pick up stuff that are like rom-coms that are cheaper, but like people in Korea, they're ambitious. They want to make these like big scale projects. So they'll be selling to Netflix, Disney, other countries, Southeast Asia, like all of these places.
When we concluded the last discussion, we talked about your short story that is being adapted into a short film. Even in the last 24 hours, like the process of where you're at right now and how other people in the kind of Cambridge community or people that are listening to the podcast could be supportive of that. I guess what's the latest update there? Can you share on that front?
Yeah. So I don't know when this podcast will be out, but I'll be doing a short crowdfunding campaign over the month of June through Seed and Spark. So if people want to go in there and look at the story and look at the short story and see if it calls to them, I would be like super interested for people to donate there. It would be super interesting for people to maybe like if they found this through Cambridge, like put Cambridge in the comments so that maybe we could figure out a way to have Cambridge in the credits or something like that.
Yep.
I don't know like what the exact structure of that would look like, so to hash that out with you a little bit more.
Yep.
But yeah, like I said, I think that story is a lot about that story in some ways is actually a lot about what I've been talking about here, which is how thinking about integration and belonging becomes a kind of poison for this main character, when I think in reality, so the way she kind of dies at the end, and the way she dies is really because of a lack of imagination or a kind of belief that she has to choose between one community or another, rather than conceptualizing perhaps belonging and individual integration or identity as a sort of like goose chase, a wild goose chase that may not actually exist, and you know, in the story ends up having a sort of tragic ending, but it is also somewhat kind of hopeful. And I think the story, you know, somewhat subtly thinks through the ways in which like belonging and integration are sometimes things that are impossible in, you know, any society that you may exist in and belong to part of the way, but not fully all of the way, and what actually understanding other people looks like in modernity and the sort of structural realities of that modernity, you know, poses on us.
When we were chatting yesterday, you had kind of explained how your year here during the COVID period was kind of helpful in the sense that maybe they weren't expectations from your parents or your family, because it seemed like they were comfortable with you doing whatever you wanted, but at least for yourself in terms of your own expectations for your career, of how maybe this isn't the best analogy, but like you were kind of unshackled by your own expectations and could pursue your own interests, and that had an influence on you coming back to Korea. As it relates to like the new projects that you end up taking up in terms of like the theme or the things that you're most interested in. So obviously the short story that you've just spoken about, but also there was if I remember correctly, a documentary that you were working on or had been published around like some sort of boxer. Like I'm just curious in terms of like, obviously there are, you only have so much time. You have many projects that you're juggling, and the projects that come in front of you that you find most interested in and decide to devote more time and attention to. Like, is there some sort of like underlying theme or interest, or like how does that process work in terms of you deciding where your priorities are at?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like honestly, and I think this is a muscle that is developable and that I didn't have originally. Like I think I was more bound by like certain logics of like this is a safe or like a good thing to do or an impressive thing to do. I like really don't care about that anymore. Like it has very little bearing on what I choose to do. And really, like I'm at a stage in my career where like if I meet someone who I'm like, oh, this person will probably finish the project that they're trying to do, I'll just like join that project. So I mean, there are like limitations to this in terms of like if there's like an ethical implication, or if I think that there's a capacity in which like there's something that I'm putting my name on that I don't necessarily believe in, then like I think I'll have more considerations or qualms about it. But like for example, like the documentary, the way that happened was like I met this Australian filmmaker by accident on the street or in my office building because he was lost, and then I helped him find the place that he was looking for, and then I sort of was talking to him, and he was talking about how he used to be like an amateur boxer, and he's like really interested in this Korean guy who has like this very unusual boxing style and became like the oldest Korean champion at the age of like 42. This was like in the early 2000s. So I was like, okay, this is a very interesting project, and this person has all of his equipment, and he like edits, and this person will probably finish this project. And I was kind of like, I think there's a capacity for this to, I think the way he was thinking about it was going to be kind of short. So like, cause he doesn't speak Korean. So like, it was going to be kind of like maybe a follow through of this boxer's, like he's doing another match upcoming in the summer, and like what the preparation process for that looks like. And I was kind of like, I think there's like a way in which I can be helpful here and help interview this person and add more nuance to whatever the project is about. And so I ended up going every weekend to Chuncheon with this filmmaker and sort of conducting the interviews and kind of being a producer for him. It's like doing all of the logistics and stuff like that. And it was very interesting, like learning about this one man's kind of like very unusual story of like, he was just like a regular office worker. And then he like his sister-in-law like took out a loan and kind of like had like, you know, gotten the family in a bunch of debt. So he was kind of like at the end of his rope, and then he kind of just decided to become a pro boxer at the age of like 38. And then like his family was like, what are you doing? And like he was like, I really want to do this. And like they were like, okay, fine, you try for a year or two. And then he ended up doing well. And like he I think he's just like as a person such a character, and like it is an interesting and unusual story that kind of reflects also on the like the way that the demands of like economic stability have changed in Korea over the past 40 to 60 years. And he's in his 60s now, so like 60 years or so. And he's like having a match upcoming, and like I don't really know anything about boxing.
He's almost 60 and he has a match upcoming.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah, I know. He's kind of a crazy dude. Yeah, and like I don't know anything about boxing, but then this, you know, filmmaker, he didn't speak Korean, and so it was kind of like a weird, and it was so serendipitous also that I was kind of like, this maybe is like something that I'm like supposed to do. Like I don't really know if there's like some kind of supernatural thing going on here. But yeah, like a lot of things like that where I'm just kind of like, if the project seems like I can have the amount of like critical and ethical control over it that I am comfortable with like participating in it and like, you know, perpetuating that this is going to move forward, then I'll pretty much just join. And like I've been trying to get a little bit more into literary translation as well, so I've been like shopping some samples around of authors that I've met through working in the drama industry. I feel like I'm like maybe yourself, this is a year for me where I was kind of like, before I decide to go back to school, if I go back to school, I'm going to see what I can do without any of the sort of like institutional rules of like the places that I'm used to, which is a lot of schools and that kind of thing, and jobs at larger companies. And that reality has been really fun. And like, you can kind of just do things like that's also kind of the thing that I realized. And so even with this film, like so much of it has just been like me asking people for money and like asking you guys for money and like crowdfunding and maybe, you know, the project, and a lot of people signing on because they're really interested and they're not taking pay, and I'm super grateful for that as well. And you know, that's a lot of like something maybe that will only be possible at the age that, you know, you and I are right now, or at this period in my life. And I'm glad that I got to sort of like develop this muscle of like, you know, I don't need to be like so good at this thing in order to try. I mean, I think there's like a reasonable level of like, if I'm going to get other people's money and time involved, like I want to be like confident in that. But I mean more in the sense of like, I was going to go to law school because I was like, I'm good at this thing, which is school. But then like, you know, the pivot was kind of like, I was really dumb like when I first came here. And then, you know, things were fine. Like I learned how to communicate with Korean people by trying to understand their lived experiences, and then, you know, figuring out within the capacity of what I could, how to relate those lived experiences to my own. And even without the crutch of like a very capacious language vehicle or capacious cultural reference, it kind of worked out. And I think that is a scary experience, but for the most part, people like figure it out. Like our parents figured it out, and like, you know, people will probably continue to figure it out. You're figuring it out.
Yes.
That kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. It's a very unusual thing to find other people who have decided to make like a similar move of just like coming to Korea with no kind of corporate or business structure kind of backing them, and just figuring it out in the process. And parts of me wish I had done something like this earlier, because there is something to be said for like how helpful preparation and expertise in a specific field can be to like a specific job that you're trying to execute on. But then there's another thing of like, you kind of have to throw yourself into the experience, and the learning that comes through the experience, you can't replicate that or prepare for that. It kind of just like happens. And I feel like that's been a lot of what's happened over the last 9 months. And I wish I would have done something like that sooner. But
I mean,
very cool.
But the reality is also that like, you know, like I have a job and like you have savings. So it's like, there's like some, you know, material limitations on like what we're able to do. But yeah, I would agree that there is a way in which like, I think, and this is also this again, not to like sound like a broken record, but like the whole like integration thing, I think can become a psychological barrier to something that is actually like very breakdownable into steps. And that's similar to like trying like moving to a new country like this, for example. It's like, it feels like maybe it's like it's a whole thing, and it kind of is, but then also it's like, integration, when integration is not the end goal, then the steps are very clear. It's like you learn the language, you try to make friends, you try to understand, you ask questions. Those are all just like the normal steps of learning anything.
Yes.
And I think that it has very, benefited me in my life to just kind of like take that, very slowly, one step at a time.
Well, you had said that when you were first in college that like living in Korea wasn't really something that you had on your mind.
No, not at all.
And like now, kind of given the situation that you're currently in, are there things that you miss about either being in like New York City or being in Europe, or I guess like you're going to be here for the next at least like 12 months, probably more for this new project, right? But from there, it's kind of just like completely open-ended. You're not sure?
Yeah, I mean, like for me also, and this is also the other thing, is that like in terms of like belonging or integration, like I think there are always parts of society that feel like I chafe against wherever I am. And like the reality of that is that like the way that I address that is like by finding people and experiences that I can make myself understood and known in. And I found that like there are things lost. Like it's easier to find people in Korea who understand a very specific thing, and then it's easier to find people in America who understand a very specific thing. And that's always just going to be like percentage wise, like you're kind of choosing one thing over another, for example. But yeah, like when I was in, I like right now, I'm not really like, I kind of am like, because, yeah, I guess this is the answer actually, is that like, because the people and the experiences are really what's motivating for me. And that's like the way that I'm trying to seek understand more about the world, understand myself better, and like see other people more clearly, see myself more clearly. Like I wasn't really planning to come back here and live again. Like also like the first time I lived here, that was also super fucking random. Like if it weren't for COVID, I wouldn't have done that. And then I wasn't going to come back either, because I was like, okay, I'm just going to like, I will either like do my PhD, or I will like go back to the States and maybe like try and write for a little while. Like I want to write and do translation a little bit as well. And everything just takes time, right? And then like my director, who I had happened to meet through like a different, like a project that I worked on, but I didn't like, we weren't in the same company, just was like, I saw him in the summer. He was like, you should come back. Like I just started my own company. And then I'm like, okay, well then I like really respect and like this person as a mentor. So I'm like, okay, this is like this is worth, tugging on the thread for 6 months. And then I'm at least 6 months to a year. And then like I'm getting, it's a job, so I'm not like saving money really, but like I like am living, right? And like totally fine. And then for the first 4 months it's like difficult, it's uncomfortable, like an adjustment period. And then after that discomfort period, I'm able to see a little bit with more clear eyes like how I fit into this structure, and like whether I like these people and I can relate to them and I can be known by them, and if I can learn from them. And I sort of was like, I think that there is like a capacity for me to be known and grow here. And then there's also like this kind of infrastructural playground where I am able to like do things that I want to do with the like support of people who are veterans in the industry and like want me to succeed. And that's very attractive. And then I'm like, okay, until that rope runs out, I'll probably stay here. And then if that rope runs out, then I'll see where, and this is like a huge privilege, obviously, but, because I have now these networks in a lot of different places, like I'll see if there are people or there are experiences that are, calling me back to the academy or back home or whatever. And I miss those things, obviously. Like there are always things that I miss about those things, but I also am, if I leave, I will miss this place. And that's just a reality that I am like, comfortable with now. Like, there's no right answer.
No, for sure. I feel like it's been similar to me where it's true that there is a certain level of stability that I have coming here because I did do some preparation in advance. But at the same time, like they're not knowing what the next step is, there's a level of discomfort that you become tested. And I feel like that's oftentimes healthy, is like your ability to digest uncertainty is usually a sign of like maturity as well. I think there is a point where it's like too much chaos, too much discomfort can like overwhelm you and be problematic. But there is, I think, a problem of like some of my peers that have worked at very large companies, they become kind of very comfortable, but they're not really working on anything that they're passionate about or interested in. And they slowly start to lose like some creative juice that maybe they had when they were like at Stanford or earlier. And so I feel like it is like kind of a ticking time bomb in the sense that the longer that you wait to do something quite radical with your life, the harder and harder it becomes. Especially if you get comfortable living a life of like luxury or just like constant abundance, is it becomes very difficult to leave that later on.
Yeah, I'm very pro discomfort, and I think this is like I want to caveat that like I feel that I'm in a very lucky position to have been given like a job and like been able to come back, and I have like a visa that lets me work here. These are all things that are like environmental factors that I'm very lucky to have.
Yes.
But like this also I think relates back to my whole like thing about belonging, is that I think sometimes, you know, I don't belong can become this crutch that, you know, we lean on to kind of stay in, you know, circles that, you know, are more familiar. And I think that there are like literal like unavoidable realities of like, there are certain like, you know, positions that, you know, I'm like a woman and like an Asian woman, and so there are like certain discomforts that are just like structural violences, and that's like true of a lot of identity positionalities. But like, for example, like I really think learning a new language is very uncomfortable. Like you have to be really willing to like sound dumb, and like I sounded so dumb I have like these Korean international friends from my time at Yale who I'm very close with and I love very dearly, and they were so sweet. They're very nice to me, but they always laugh now because I used to say the like most weird, like the most fucked up Korean that I think one time they were talking to me about how like I was trying to say 우산 and I said 비산 or something like that, and then they would be like, they understood everything, but then they would just like let it go. But like I knew I was like not very good, but I was just talking Korean a lot, and that's kind of a discomfort of like, I am not one of you guys, but I'm kind of like making an effort to understand and like connect. And I think people that discomfort, and also the discomfort of like things that you take for granted as like intellectual or ideological realities, like change when you like are in a new culture or a new language, and like that discomfort I think is also very productive in terms of like widening people's intellectual flexibility. I think intellectual flexibility is something that I think is very important, and like, you know, allowing us to reframe or reconsider like what are the, you know, ideologies that we very much take for granted and do not realize are things that have been like culturally indoctrinated into us or socially indoctrinated into us. That sometimes also like, you know, being in a new language or in a new culture is helpful to kind of break out of that cycle. And so yeah, I would say that like I'm pretty pro like discomfort, and also like, you know, I think being alive is uncomfortable. Like, you know, people move new places, or they're in new experiences, and like that's just like uncomfortable. Like sometimes it's not, you know, sometimes it is structural, or it is something about, you know, you, and it's important to pay attention to that. But sometimes like it's not about your identity or about you as a person. Sometimes it's about the fact that like being alive is kind of an uncomfortable thing, and
yes.
like trying to be known in a world where like everyone has different experiences is very uncomfortable, feels very vulnerable. Like those are all discomforts in and of themselves as well. And so I feel very lucky and grateful also that I've had the opportunity to like, you know, had this very controlled kind of like permission structure to, you know, come outside of like what was comfortable for me and what I felt like got me praise and was acceptable, and that was like going to a really good school and whatever, and then moving away from that and becoming more like, okay, I'm doing these things because I want to learn, or because I'm really interested in the resources that are offered by these institutions rather than the prestige or the elitism or the sense of safety that they offer. And then, you know, that as a muscle kind of growing until this point where I'm kind of like now just like asking people for money to like shoot this random film that I'm like, I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but like, you know, it's something I want to do and believe in.
The one guy from the documentary, the boxer guy, he doesn't speak English, I presume.
No,
he's only Korean.
He doesn't speak, well, he speaks English like very, he's like hilarious. He speaks English very like, he knows certain phrases and he'll like shout them, and then he also like knows, this would be really interesting for you actually, because he also knows a bit of Japanese, because like basically during the like during the 70s and 80s, he like went to Japan and was like this traveling salesman, and then he like went to the Soviet Union back when it was still the Soviet Union and would sell these like knockoff American like products for like that he would import, like drop ship from Korea to in the Soviet Union, because it was like they were like contraband and they were more expensive. So he worked there for a little while. He had like a gun while he was there or something like that as well, because there was like so much crime going on. And then he was in the special forces when he was in the military, and like that was when he first learned how to box, because he like they used to like let them get off training if they would like learn a sport, because they were trying to like find people to like go to the Olympics or something at that time. like that's when he first learned boxing, and then he like came out and did all this like he lived in Japan and then lived in the Soviet Union, came back to Korea, and then like worked at this office job, and then his like sister-in-law bought these like this supermarket chain, and then it like they totally like went bust. This was like the economy wasn't great because I think it's after right after IMF, and then that's when he became a boxer. And he has a very interesting boxing story too. He's like kind of famous in Korea because he at the time there was all these like documentary like specials on KBS about him because he was like so unusual, and then also like there was an additional factor of like he had broken his hand, dislocated a bone in his hand right before the final for the Korean champion. So he was going to drop out. And then he like happened to hear on the radio about this one like French boxer who didn't have an arm. It was like a kickboxer or something. And then he was like, ugh, if this person like doesn't even have an arm and they're like a kickboxer, like I have no excuse. So then he just fought with his like left hand dislocated and just like punched with his right hand, and he won, and he was like, it was like a whole thing.
It's a good another reason why eventually I'll need to at least be able to understand Korean, because then I could actually like have a conversation with this guy, but also like even the director, like if he speaks English, and I assume he's going to want to share about his documentary too, I feel like it would be fun to talk to him about how he found the story. We should wrap up because it's 6. Yeah, this is part 2, but there could easily be a 1.5 hour long part 3. But for now, we'll close it at that, and maybe TBD. But thank you for doing the part 2. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tiger.